Across the galaxy's eastern rim, where ancient stars once sang in harmonies of light and gravitational resonance, a profound stillness spreads like ink through water. Entire sectors that had known 10 millennia of psychic storms now rest in absolute quiet, their populations freed from the predations of entities that hunt through dreams and feed on souls. The great navigator houses speak in whispered councils of regions where their gifts fail utterly, where the warp itself recoils as if wounded by some fundamental negation. Astropaths fall silent mid-transmission, their last messages fragmenting into static as an expanding void devours not just sound, but the very possibility of psychic resonance. In this enforced peace, something precious dies with each passing day, the spark of inspiration, the chaos of unfiltered thought, the terrible and wonderful essence that transforms mere survival into life worth living. This is the silent march, and it advances with the inexorable patience of entropy itself. We truly love and care for you, dear listener. Before we begin this tale of fading empires and impossible choices, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now let's get started. Upon the throne world of Kol Serath, beneath the sky the colour of burnished steel, Farron Ethan Sable stands before the greatest and most terrible achievement of his immortal existence. The null engine rises before him like a mechanical mountain, its surface crawling with hieroglyphs that predate the birth of human civilization. Conduits of living metal snake across the obsidian chamber floor, pulsing with energies that exist in the spaces between reality's fabric. Each pulse sends another wave of absolute silence racing across the stars, a tide of nothingness that washes over worlds and leaves them cleansed of the warp's touch, and perhaps something more. Ethan's form is a masterwork of necrodermis artistry, his once mortal frame reborn in metals that remember the heat of stellar cores. Where flesh once knew warmth and weariness, now perfect machinery hums with eternal purpose. His face retains the noble bearing of the king he once was, though his eyes burn with the cold fire of stars long dead. Upon his brow sits a circlet of impossible geometry that allows him to perceive the warp's retreat across 1,000 light years, each world's transition from chaos to silence registering as a faint tremor in his consciousness. The Tertius Gamma transition is complete, my lord, comes a voice from behind him, soft as whispered prayer. Ira Nullborn approaches with the careful steps of one who has learned to move through a universe that flinches from her presence. She, alone among mortals, can stand in this chamber without her mind fracturing from the engine's emanations. Born a blank, cursed and blessed with a soul shadow that repels the immaterial, she has become his most trusted advisor, and perhaps the closest thing to a friend his metal heart can know. Complete, Ethan repeats, tasting the word like ash. Tell me, Ira, what do they do with their evenings now that they cannot dream? How do they create art when inspiration itself has been filtered from their souls? The question hangs between them, heavy with implications neither wishes to fully explore. Through the chamber's viewing ports, they can see the surface of Kol Serath, stretching away in geometric perfection. Cities of living metal house populations that no longer dream, their thoughts flowing in orderly channels carved by necessity rather than wonder. The reports indicate adaptation, Era says carefully, her voice carrying the weight of unspoken doubts. No demonic incursions, no psychic storms. The children sleep peacefully now, without nightmares of blue-eyed predators or burning angels. But they also sleep without stories, without the small magics that make childhood bearable. Before Ethan can respond, The chamber's great doors iris open with a sound like grinding continents. Magos Zerion enters, his robes rustling with the whisper of hidden mechanisms. Half of his face has been replaced with augmetic sensors that glow with sickly radiation, while mechadendrites writhe from his shoulders like metallic serpents. He approaches the engine with something approaching reverence, his remaining organic eye wide with fascination. The resonance patterns are exquisite, Pharaon, Zerion intones, his voice a harmony of flesh and vox grill. Each expansion of the null field creates perfect mathematical progressions. We are not merely silencing the warp, we are composing a symphony of negation that spans the stars themselves. A symphony, Ethan muses, that no one can hear. Precisely. Zerion's enthusiasm radiates from his form in waves of binary cant and electromagnetic excitement. Pure function without the corruption of sentiment. The Omnissiah himself could not have conceived a more perfect fusion of purpose and execution. Ethan turns from the viewing port to study his companions, the mortal who carries silence in her very bones, and the tech priest who sees beauty in the absence of beauty. They represent the two paths before him, acceptance of necessary sacrifice or the pursuit of perfection regardless of cost. Yet neither can answer the question that haunts his processing cores in the deep hours when even immortals must contemplate their choices. Somewhere in the labyrinth of his mechanical mind, a memory stirs like wind through autumn leaves, the sound of laughter, high and clear, carrying the music of absolute joy. A child's voice calling his name, not his title, not his honorific, but the name his mother gave him in the flesh time before crowns and conquest. The memory is fragmentary, corrupted by eons of storage and the trauma of biotransference, but it burns with an intensity that all his logic circuits cannot diminish. The Valtera system has requested our protection, he says, his voice steady despite the chaos in his thoughts. 6 worlds, 43 billion souls. The Crimson Tears warband has been raiding their outer colonies for months. My lord, Era says carefully, Valtera includes 3 navigator houses and a significant astropath choir. The economic disruption alone will be temporary, Ethan interrupts. They will adapt, as all life adapts. The alternative is to leave them to the mercies of chaos, and we have seen what those mercies entail. He moves to the engine's primary control interface, a web of crystalline nodes that respond to his touch with cascades of emerald light. Each node represents a world, a system, a sector of space where the warp's influence has been severed like a gangrenous limb. The pattern spreads outward from Kol Serath in perfect geometric progression, a mandala of enforced tranquility that grows with each passing day. As his fingers hover over the activation runes, Ethan feels the familiar weight of choice. In his quest to protect the galaxy from the darkness between stars, has he become something far more subtle and perhaps more terrible than any demon prince? Not a destroyer of worlds, but a thief of souls, stealing not life but the essence that makes life worth living. The child's laughter echoes in his memory again, and for a moment he wonders if the voice belongs to someone he saved or someone he failed to save. The question remains unanswered as he presses his palm to the control matrix. The null engine awakens with a sound like reality tearing. Deep within its core, technologies that predate the Imperium of man begin their ancient work. The warp shimmers and recoils as another wave of absolute negation races toward distant suns. On the tactical display, the Valthara system appears as 6 points of light, soon to be encompassed by the expanding sphere of silence. The field will reach Veltera Prime in 18 hours. Zarian reports, his sensors tracking the invisible tide. Complete psychic isolation within 48 hours of initial contact. 48 hours for an entire system to say goodbye to dreams, to inspiration, to the terrible and wonderful chaos of unfiltered thought. In 48 hours, 6 worlds will be safe from the predations of chaos, but they will also be diminished in ways they cannot yet comprehend. The silent march continues, Ethan whispers, watching as another system prepares to fall under his protection. In the depths of space, ancient mechanisms older than empires begin their work, and somewhere in the darkness, 43 billion souls prepare to discover what peace truly costs. The engine hums with satisfaction, its work nearly complete for another day. Soon, the Veltera system will know the blessing of perfect quiet, and Ethan Sable will have taken another step towards saving a galaxy that may no longer recognize salvation when it arrives. The price of absolute security, he has learned, is absolute silence, and in that silence the echo of a child's laughter grows ever more precious and ever more distant. In the deepest vaults of Kol Serath, where the architecture itself seems to breathe with the slow pulse of eons, Ethan Sable stands before a sight that would break a mortal heart, if hearts of flesh still beat within these halls. The resurrection chamber stretches before him like a cathedral of loss, its walls lined with empty alcoves that once held the greatest warriors of his dynasty. All have awakened to serve the silent march, all save one. At the chamber's heart, a single stasis coffin waits in patient vigil, its crystalline surface inscribed with hieroglyphs that predate the rise of humanity. The sight triggers cascades of memory that his logic cores cannot suppress, fragments of a past that burns like stellar fire through the cold perfection of his mechanical consciousness. The activation of the Veltera null field has stirred ancient currents, and now the weight of 60 million years presses against his awareness like the gravity of a dying star. He remembers the screams first, not the roars of warriors dying gloriously in battle, but the thin, desperate cries of children whose minds were being devoured by entities that wore the faces of beloved grandparents. The warp storms had come without warning to the Necrontyr worlds, tearing holes in reality through which nightmares poured like acid rain. His people, blessed and cursed with psychic sensitivity, became beacons for predators that fed on consciousness itself. The sky above his birth world had bled crimson and violet as demonic entities pressed against the barriers between dimensions. He remembers standing in the royal gardens, watching flowers wilt as the very air grew thick with malevolent presence. His wife had collapsed first, her body convulsing as something ancient and hungry tried to wear her flesh like a costume. Then the children began falling. Bright minds snuffed out one by one as the warp claimed its due. The memory shifts, showing him the great council chambers where desperate leaders sought solutions to an impossible crisis. The Citan came to them then, beings of living starlight who spoke in voices like the death songs of galaxies. The Nightbringer had worn a form of terrible beauty, promising salvation through transcendence, freedom through the simple expedient of abandoning flesh entirely. My lord, Era's voice cuts through the millennia like a blade through silk. She stands at the chamber's entrance, her presence creating a pocket of absolute silence that makes even the air seem to recoil. The Veltera transition reports are troubling. There are complications. Ethan turns from the stasis coffin, his luminous eyes focusing on the present with visible effort. What manner of complications? The children have stopped drawing, she says simply, and the words carry more weight than any military report. They set down their crayons and say the colors feel wrong. The poets speak of words that taste like ash. The musicians find their instruments heavy as stone. Each observation lands like a physical blow against his consciousness. This is what his gift of peace brings. Not just safety from demonic predation, but the slow strangulation of everything that makes existence more than mere survival. Magos Zerion believes we should accelerate the timeline. Hera continues, her voice carefully neutral. Complete the transition before organized resistance can form. He argues that temporary cultural disruption is preferable to permanent spiritual contamination. Temporary disruption. The Citan had used similar words when they offered their bargain. The star gods had promised that the biotransference would be a brief transition, a moment of transformation that would birth a new form of existence. They had not mentioned that the process would consume souls like fuel, leaving behind perfect mechanical echoes of what once lived and loved and dreamed. The decision was never really a choice, Ethan says, though whether to Hera or to the ghosts of memory, he cannot say. When your civilization is dying and someone offers to make the pain stop forever, you don't calculate consequences. You simply accept salvation, whatever its price. The chamber's great doors iris open with the whisper of perfectly calibrated machinery. Magos, Zerion, enters, his robes rustling with the sound of hidden mechanisms, his augmetic sensors glowing with barely contained enthusiasm. He approaches with the measured pace of one delivering a triumph. Pharon, the Velthara integration exceeds all projections, he announces, his vox grill harmonizing with organic vocal cords to create an oddly musical effect. Psychic activity has decreased by 91% in the past 12 hours. Demonic manifestations have ceased entirely across 5 of the 6 worlds. The population shows remarkable adaptability to their new circumstances. Adaptability, Ethan repeats, tasting the word like poison. Tell me, Magos, what have they adapted to? Efficiency, my lord. Order. Without the chaotic interference of uncontrolled psychic phenomena, their societies function with unprecedented smoothness. Crime rates have plummeted. Educational performance has standardized around practical applications rather than frivolous creative expression. The elimination of frivolous creative expression. Ethan feels something crack in his processing cores. Not a malfunction, but the sound of a heart breaking in frequencies only machines can hear. There is something I must show you, he says to Hera, his voice carrying the weight of confession. He approaches the chamber's central dais and activates a hidden sequence along its edge. Panels withdraw like eyelids opening, revealing a vault that glows with colors that exist only in the spaces between light and shadow. Within the vault, a single capsule rises to the surface with a crystalline chime. Inside, a delicate lattice of silver, filaments drifts like captured starlight, maintaining geometric patterns that no natural force could create or sustain. Pattern matrix designation IL-OR-3, Ethan says, and the syllables fall between them like secrets told without permission. Memory fragments recovered from the biotransference process. I have been refining them for 4 millennia. Hera's eyes widen with understanding. Ilio. My son, Ethan confirms, and the word scrapes against his vox grill as if it had to carve itself a passage through living metal. During the biotransference, when souls were poured into vessels of imperishable alloy, not all fragments found their intended destinations. Something of him clung to me. I have been gathering those fragments, reconstructing what was lost. He remembers the boy's laughter, bright and musical, carrying the joy of someone who saw wonder in the smallest things. Ilior had been 8 years old when the warp sickness took him, his small body racked with convulsions as demonic entities fought for control of his mind. Ethan had held his son's hand as the biotransference began, promising that everything would be better on the other side, that they would be together in their new forms of living metal. The promise had been a lie. When Ethan awakened in his perfected body, Ilior was gone, not dead, for death implies the possibility of peace, but simply absent, his essence scattered across the quantum foam like light through a prism. "It won't be him," Era says softly, her voice carrying the terrible gentleness of absolute truth. "The patterns are beautiful, my lord, but they are echoes. The chaos that made him unique, the unpredictability that made him alive, that cannot be captured in crystal and code." Ethan closes the vault with a thought, the panels sealing with a hiss, like a long-held breath finally released. He knows she is right, has always known it, but knowledge and acceptance are different forms of torment entirely. "I adjust my emotional protocols," he admits, his voice barely above a whisper. "I modulate the resonance frequencies until I believe I am feeling what I ought to feel. But the sensation never lasts, and I realize I have only performed emotion rather than experienced it. It should frighten me more than it does." "It does frighten you," Era replies. "That's why you hide hope in a vault and call it memory." The observation cuts deeper than any weapon forged in the heart of a star. In his quest to save his son, he has created the perfect prison for the boy's essence. The resurrection protocols can rebuild Ilia's form in imperishable metal, can restore his memories with mathematical precision, but they cannot restore the one thing that mattered most: the capacity for genuine surprise, for growth, for the beautiful imperfection that defines mortal existence. He remembers their last conversation, before the warp sickness took complete hold. Ilior had been building a sculpture from scraps of metal and wire, creating something that followed no pattern except the one his imagination imposed upon it. When Ethan asked what it was supposed to be, the boy had laughed and said, "It's whatever it wants to be, Papa." That's what makes it beautiful. The memory crystallizes into perfect clarity, and with it comes a terrible understanding. Beauty lies not in perfection, but in the possibility of imperfection. Life finds meaning, not in the absence of suffering, but in the choice to create meaning despite suffering. In his crusade to eliminate chaos, he has eliminated choice itself. "The expansion will continue," Ethan says finally, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority and absolute doubt. "But perhaps we might proceed with greater care. Monitor not just the elimination of threats, but the preservation of what makes existence worth preserving." It is a small concession, a crack in the perfect logic of the silent march. But sometimes, Ethan reflects as he gazes upon the sealed vault, the most important victories are measured not in worlds conquered, but in moments of doubt that prevent us from conquering too much. The resurrection chamber falls silent save for the distant pulse of the null engine, counting down the heartbeats of a galaxy slowly learning to live without dreams. And in that silence, the echo of a child's laughter grows both more precious and more distant, a reminder of everything gained and everything lost in the name of salvation. The Imperial cruiser, eternal vigilance, materializes at the edge of the Valthara system, with none of the usual violence that marks a vessel's emergence from the warp. No reality-shearing thunder announces their arrival. No psychic aftershocks ripple through the Imperium's currents. Instead, there is only profound, unnatural quiet, a silence so complete it seems to press against the hull like a physical weight. The ship's Geller fields flicker uncertainly, their protective energies suddenly rendered obsolete by the absence of any warp presence to guard against. On the command bridge, Inquisitor Velthara Keth stands before the main viewing port, watching an aurora that should not exist dance across the system's edge. The phenomenon defies every treatise on psychic null fields in the Ordo Malleus archives. Instead of simple absence, here colours flow like liquid starlight, beautiful and wrong in ways that make her augmetic eye register phantom sensations. She has spent 3 decades in service to the Golden Throne, hunting heretics and purging the taint of chaos from 1,000 worlds. Yet never has she encountered something that achieves the Imperium's greatest goal while filling her with such profound unease. "Navigators report, Inquisitor," comes a strained voice from behind her. Jorik Voss approaches with the careful steps of a man whose world has suddenly shifted beneath his feet. The 4th-generation scion of House Voss carries himself with the aristocratic bearing of his bloodline, but his face bears the pallor of someone who has lost a fundamental sense. His third eye, normally sealed beneath blessed parchments, weeps silver tears that trace luminous paths down his cheeks. "I can guide us to the threshold," he says, his voice carrying professional pride wounded by impossible circumstances. Beyond that point, the warp simply ends. Not blocked, not diverted. It ceases to exist as if reality has been carefully edited. I have never experienced such absolute silence in the Imperium. Valtera studies her navigator with growing concern. The ability to perceive the warp's currents across vast distances is both blessing and curse for his kind. But to see Jorik reduced to ordinary human sight is like watching a master musician suddenly struck deaf. Yet beneath his distress, she detects something else. A relief so profound, he seems almost ashamed of it. "Take us through," she commands, though every instinct screams against advancing into the unknown. Slow approach. Full sensor sweeps. I want to understand what we're dealing with before we commit to any action. As the eternal vigilance crosses the threshold, the change is immediate and unsettling. The constant psychic static that has formed the background noise of Veldera's existence, the whisper of the Emperor's light, the distant screams of demons, the endless chatter of astropathic communications, simply stops. The silence is so complete it feels like deafness, leaving her with the disturbing sensation that some vital part of her has been surgically removed. Jorik collapses to his knees with a sound like breaking crystal, his third eye sealing shut with an audible snap. Blood runs from his nose in thin streams, but his expression carries wonder rather than pain. "Emperor, preserve me," he whispers. "I can think. For the first time since my awakening, I can hear my own thoughts without the warp's voice drowning them out. Is this what peace feels like?" The question hangs in the air like an accusation as they establish contact with Velthera Prime. The world appears on their tactical displays as a sphere of blue and green perfection, its orbital installations functioning with clockwork precision. No debris fields mark the sites of space battles. No energy signatures indicate ongoing conflicts. The planet simply exists, turning in its orbit with the patient rhythm of a world that has forgotten how to fear. "Imperial vessel Eternal Vigilance, you are cleared for high orbit," comes the response to their hail, spoken in perfectly modulated Gothic that carries no trace of stress or urgency. "Be advised that psychic phenomena are suppressed within this system. Adjust your operational parameters accordingly. Welcome to the silence. Welcome to the silence." The phrase carries implications that make Valtera's augmetic fingers clench involuntarily. She has devoted her life to protecting humanity from chaos, Yet here she finds a solution that feels more disturbing than the problem it claims to solve. Sergeant Marcus Korath of the Cadian 47th emerges from the shadows near the bridge's tactical station, his scarred face bearing the expression of a man confronting the impossible. His uniform tells the story of a dozen campaigns against the forces of darkness, but his eyes hold something she has rarely seen in veteran guardsmen: uncertainty. "The surface reports are coming in, Inquisitor," he says, his voice carefully controlled. "No demon sightings in 18 days. No cultist activity. Even petty crime has dropped to statistical insignificance. But the cultural assessments..." He trails off, struggling with words that refuse to capture what he has witnessed. The reports paint a picture of adaptation that chills Valtera more than any demon incursion. Art galleries stand empty, their curators unable to explain why colors seem muted and forms lack emotional resonance. Musicians speak of instruments that feel heavy in their hands, as if the music has drained out of them like water from a broken vessel. Children play games that follow rigid rules, their laughter mechanical and precise. When Governor Thaddeus Vex appears on their communication screen, Valtera barely recognizes the man she has worked with on 2 previous occasions. His face, once lined with the stress of constant vigilance against chaos cults, now carries the smooth serenity of someone who has forgotten how to worry. "Inquisitor Keth," he says, his voice devoid of the nervous energy she remembers. "Welcome to our new reality. The peace is beyond description. We sleep without nightmares. We work without fear of demonic incursion. Our children grow up without the terror that has haunted humanity for millennia. And your astropaths, Governor? Your sanctioned psychers?" Freed from their burden, Vex replies with gentle certainty. They serve now as administrators, teachers, productive members of society rather than living weapons against forces beyond mortal comprehension. The conversation continues, but Valtera finds herself increasingly disturbed by what she does not hear. No passion when Vex speaks of his family. No anger when discussing the bureaucratic inefficiencies that once drove him to distraction. No joy when describing his world's newfound peace. He speaks like a man describing a mathematical equation, accurate, precise, and utterly without emotional investment. As evening approaches in the ship's cycle, long-range sensors detect contacts approaching from the system's outer reaches. The formations resolve into vessels unlike anything in Imperial archives, sleek crescents of living metal that move with the fluid grace of predators born in the void. Necron ships, but not arranged for battle. They approach with the measured pace of a diplomatic escort, their formation speaking of intention rather than aggression. "Inquisitor," the communications officer calls, disbelief evident in his voice. "We're receiving a transmission from the lead vessel. It's in perfect Gothic. The main display flickers and resolves into an image that defies every assumption about Xenos intentions. The figure before them clearly belongs to the Necron race. Living metal skin that gleams like polished silver. Eyes that burn with cold fire. The unmistakable bearing of ancient nobility. Yet something in its posture suggests not conquest, but conversation. "I am Ethan Sable, Farron of the Pariah Worlds," the figure says, its voice carrying harmonics that speak of intelligence vast and alien, yet undeniably rational. "I extend greetings to the servants of the Corpse Emperor and an invitation to discourse. Your presence suggests questions about our methods. Perhaps we might find answers that serve us both." The bridge falls silent, save for the hum of machinery. In 40 years of service, Valtera has never faced a moment like this. an enemy offering negotiation instead of annihilation, a solution that might be worse than the problem it solves, and the terrible possibility that everything she has believed about the nature of good and evil might be more complex than she ever imagined. "This is Inquisitor Valthara Keth of the Order Malleus," she responds, her voice steady despite the chaos in her thoughts. "I accept your invitation to discourse, fair and sable. Perhaps it is time we understood what peace truly costs." The transmission ends, leaving the bridge crew to contemplate the impossible. An Inquisitor preparing to negotiate with the Xenos, a Necron offering alliance instead of extinction, and somewhere between them, the fate of a galaxy that must choose between the chaos of freedom and the perfection of silence. The first contact between the Imperium and the Pariah Worlds begins not with the roar of weapons, but with the whispered promise of understanding, and the terrible question of whether some truths are too dangerous to learn. The null engine sang in a register only machines and ghosts could hear, a pressure in the bones of the world that made even the walls seem to hold their breath. In the depth of Kol Serath, past vaults sealed with equations and oaths, the resurrection chamber woke to its ancient task. Arrays of crystalline pylons rotated with the grace of planets, their facets catching light that was not light, casting reflections that showed not faces, but possibilities. Ethan stood at the dais like a penitent before a forbidden altar, hands suspended over controls that remembered the warmth of stars. He had sworn never to touch this sequence again. He had lied to the galaxy and to himself. Era watched him without speaking. Her presence bent the air into a hush deeper than silence, a negative pressure that turned incantation into breath. She wore no armor, only the plain dark coat of a traveler who has chosen discomfort over pretense, and the faint lines of exhaustion carved beneath her eyes were medals that no court could award. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the complicated mercy of someone determined to keep you alive even when you ask her to help you die. If you do this, you change the shape of every decision that follows. Ethan did not answer immediately. He traced the outline of the central sarcophagus with a finger of living metal, its surface etched with the glyphs he had taught the chamber to recognize as love. "The Imperium is at our threshold," he said at last. "They bring questions about the cost of peace. I would like to answer one of my own before I face theirs. Is there a way to hold the quiet without strangling the song?" Magos Zerion emerged from the shadows like a verdict, his mechadendrites fanned in a halo of surgical intent, each tipped with a tool more precise than prayer. The red of his robe seemed obscene in a room defined by pallor. "The protocol set is ready," he said, with the bright hunger of a man who has never feared the consequences of being correct. Pattern matrix ILOR3 stabilized to within 8 sigmas. Organic scaffold synthesis will occur within the null cradle, minimizing warp interference. We may proceed Era's gaze cut to the Magos with a flake of steel. "We are not installing a component. We are instantiating a variable," Zerion replied calmly, "a living control experiment to answer the Pharaon's question. In the absence of the warp, can spontaneity arise? If it cannot, the galaxy must decide which loss it prefers." Ethan lowered his hands to the controls. He had designed the sequence in a century of grief and a minute of hope, a ritual of numbers meant to coax order into compassion. Glyphs bloomed beneath his touch, unlocking systems that had slept with one eye open since the wars that ended the age of gods. The sarcophagus inhaled. The chamber dimmed. Somewhere very far away, a dying star remembered the warmth of a child's hand. The process began with a seed of light suspended between lattice points. It drew filaments to itself like a spider tugging a web into being. Threads of living metal woven with strands of cultured tissue in a braid too fine for mortal eyes to pass. No black stone imprisoned a soul here. No hungry god was owed a debt. The null field held steady, a cradle of absence that kept predation at bay, while possibility tried to learn the shape of a boy. Era stepped forward when the first tremor rippled through the scaffold, both hands open and empty. "I am here," she said, as if the nascent form could understand her. "Breathe when you can. Blink when you must. Everything else can wait," Zerian's instruments whispered. Cardioelectric impulse detected, neural architecture assembling. Memory engrams beginning to align with the matrix. Note the variance. 27% divergence from reference pattern. This is not duplication. It is interpolation. "Good," Ethan said, and the word startled him with its sincerity. He had feared perfection more than failure. He did not want a museum of what was. He wanted a future that could still surprise him. Skin formed like dawn over a landscape, paling then flushing with color that learned itself as it spread. Hair came last, a soft darkness on a scalp shaped by a geometry kinder than mathematics. The eyelids fluttered, and then eyes opened to the world, a blue so deep it held the memory of seas that no longer existed, with a ring of faint luminescence like the corona of a gentle star. The boy inhaled. The sound broke Ethan's composure more cleanly than any blade could have. He had not realized how long it had been since breath mattered to him, how much of the galaxy's music consisted of that simple exchange of air for time. "Hello," Era whispered, and offered her hand as if approaching a wild creature. "I am Era. This is a safe place to be confused." The boy looked at her hand, at the room, at Ethan, and then at the ceiling, as if listening for something only he could hear. "It's quiet," he said, and his voice was both familiar and not, pitched higher, but with an undercurrent of harmonic resonance that hinted at what had made him possible. The loud quiet. It pushes and hugs. Era glanced at Ethan, one eyebrow tilted toward a question that had always been eventual. Ethan knelt, lowering himself to the child's height, not out of strategy, but reverence. "The quiet keeps nightmares away," he said gently. "Sometimes it keeps other things away too." The boy considered this with a gravity that did not diminish his youth. "Nightmares bite," he agreed solemnly, "but stories dance. If the quiet makes the biting stop, does it make the dancing stop too?" Zerion's quills skittered across a data slate. Cognitive abstraction present. Metaphor generation within normal human range. Note the oscillation between sensory language and conceptual mapping. Fascinating. Era's hand closed around one of the Magos's mechadendrites with surprising speed. "If you prod him like a machine before he says his name, I'll see what the quiet does to augmetic joints." Ethan almost smiled. "Do you know your name?" he asked the boy. The boy tilted his head. "I know a sound like a bell. I know a word that feels like warm stone in sunlight. I know you are father when you say my son. Are those all names?" "They can be," Ethan said, and something ancient inside him dissolved like salt in rain. "One of your names is Ilio." The word settled over the child as if it had been waiting for a home. He repeated it, and with the second utterance it belonged to him. "Ilio," he said, tasting it. "That sounds like climbing." Era laughed softly, and in the laugh there was an ache she did not bother to hide. She draped a simple cloak over Ilio's shoulders, the fabric absorbing the chilly air that kept the machinery honest. "Can you stand?" Ilio stood. The grace of the motion was neither mechanical precision nor infant wobble. It was something in between, full of small corrections and unashamed curiosity. He reached for Ethan's face and touched the cool plane of necrodermis where skin would have been. "Does it hurt to be hard?" Ethan's reply failed somewhere between truth and mercy. "Sometimes," he said, "sometimes it doesn't let me feel things I should." "Then it's armor," Ilya concluded, with the simple brutality of children. "Armor is for battles." "Are we in a battle?" Zerion answered before Ethan could. "Always," he said, with the joy of a craftsman discussing tools. "Some battles you can see, some you can measure, some you can only survive." Ira placed herself between Ilya and the instruments with a subtlety that made the act look like she was merely admiring a machine. "You will not tag him like a specimen," she told the Magos, voice gentle as snowfall and twice as cold. "He will have a day before you turn him into a chart." "We do not have a day," Zerion countered. "The Inquisitor's fleet has anchored in high orbit. Negotiations begin at second bell. A Necron heir of unknown type is a strategic anomaly and a potential leverage point. If we conceal him, we forfeit an advantage. If we reveal him, we invite exploitation. Either way, variables multiply. Either way," Ethan said quietly. "He is a person." That ended the argument, at least in this room. It did not change the truth that Zerion had named. Every choice from this point would be filtered through Ilior's existence. Ethan had claimed to act for the greater good, but he had used the resources of an empire to resurrect what he loved. He had made a father's decision and called it strategy. He could taste the hypocrisy like iron. He led Ilior to the viewing port, where Kol Serath spread beneath them like a map of intent. Cities traced alphabets across the dark, each glyph a promise about how to live in the absence of terror. The null engine's hum deepened, a reminder that safety and silence were still synonyms here. "What is that sound?" Ilior asked. "The engine," Ethan said. "It makes the quiet." "Why?" "So that nightmares find nowhere to land." Ilya pressed his palm to the glass. Clear oils marked a print the chamber's sterile air did not know how to accept. If they cannot land, do they go somewhere else? Or do they fall forever? He frowned, trying to feel the shape of a consequence whose edges were larger than the room. If they fall forever, do they turn into something worse? Or do they learn to fly different? Era watched Ethan as if the boy's questions were not questions at all, but knives wrapped in ribbon. "He will never be safe from the truth," she murmured. "That is the price of honesty." Ethan reached for a memory and found a fragment that survived translation. He withdrew a small, battered object from a recess in his chest plate, a toy no Archaeotech sage would recognize. Two interlocking rings of wood smoothed by years of small hands. Ilior took it with the greed of recognition, even if he did not remember why he knew it. He twisted the rings, laughed at how they refused to part, and then laughed harder when a twist he had not intended set them free. "There," he announced triumphant. "The quiet let me do a mistake until it worked." Zerion made a strangled noise that might have been delight. Stochastic problem solving under null field conditions. "This data alone." Ira lifted a finger. Zerion fell silent. A chime sounded, delicate as frost cracking. Ethan opened the channel with a thought. "Farron," came the voice of over-adjunct Selk, crisp with protocol. "The human Inquisitor requests parley in 1 hour. She brings armed escorts and civil negotiators. Shall I prepare the Hall of Echoes?" "Prepare it," Ethan said. He considered the 1,000 forms of caution that jostled for precedence, each a plausible denial of fear. He looked at Ilior, who was turning the rings in his hands with obvious plans to test every wrong way they could bend, and seal the resurrection chamber under occlusion protocols. No one enters without error understood. When the channel closed, Ethan faced the choice he had been avoiding: hide Ilior and lie by omission to an enemy who had offered discourse. Reveal Ilior and expose him to the weapons that words could be. Each path betrayed something he claimed to hold sacred. Teach him, he said to Era, because some decisions could be postponed only long enough to become clear. Teach him stories that dance. Teach him how to be wrong without breaking. Keep him out of the Magos's inventory. Era inclined her head, accepting a responsibility that would outlast any treaty. I will teach him to be loud in the quiet, she said, and to hear what the quiet tries to hide. Ilior looked between them, solemn again. Will I dream? He asked. Ethan considered the empire of silence he had built to save a galaxy that might not want saving at his price. He considered the parley above, where mortal emissaries would ask for definitions while he tried to offer meanings. He considered the vault where he had kept a hope small enough to control until it asked to be a person. I hope so, he said, which was not an answer, and the only answer he trusted. Above them, the Hall of Echoes lit like a sunrise trapped beneath stone. Beyond the walls, the null engine gathered itself to press its blessing outward, a tide set to erase 1,000 nightmares and 1,000 songs with the same indifferent wave. Ethan set his course toward the negotiation and left a piece of himself in the room where breath mattered. Behind him, a child's laughter rose, uneven and bright, daring the quiet to make room. By the third day inside the Valthara null zone, the ship's Vox was no longer a river of screams and prayer. It had become a ledger. Petition after petition arrived on the inquisitorial channel with the quiet certainty of arithmetic. Agri worlds along the Orphean Reach requesting inclusion. Forge moons, whose Maggie begged for a silence that would let them work without the warp's interference. Pilgrim fleets pleading for sanctuary inside the hush. Just as many messages came edged in fury. Governors accusing the Pariah Worlds of strangling human potential. Bishops condemning the silence as a heresy against the Emperor's divine spark. Admirals warning that an Imperium without navigators would become a chain of islands starving each other to death. Inquisitor Valtera Keth read them all. She listened to a vicar from Sancta Lys, who described, almost apologetically, how the hymns felt flatter in the quiet, even as the nightmares stopped. She studied a mech scribe's statistical triumphs from Rofe and Tertius, crime down 51%, industrial accidents reduced by 2/3, set beside an artisan's confession that pigments no longer sang on canvas, that the colours had become obedient and dull. She watched a recording from a frontier world, whose governor had authorized entry into the null to save his people from a demon plague. The plague withered and died at the boundary. The governor's daughter survived, and her first word after recovery was, "Why does the sky sound like glass?" Jorik Voss remained on his cot in the navigator's sanctum, eyes bandaged by a medici, who confessed he had no liturgy for this. Without the warp's tides pressing against his third eye, Jorik looked smaller, less like a scion of a great house, and more like a man who had spent his life shouting across a storm, only to discover the storm had been inside him. "I can hear," he told Valtara, in a voice that would not carry beyond the curtain. "My own pulse, my own thoughts, and they terrify me because now I know how loud the rest of it always was. If this quiet spreads, my house loses purpose. If it stops, My mind goes back to drowning. What verdict do you write for that? The ecclesiarchy's representatives sent declarations that bled incense and threat in equal measure. The choir master of the sanctified light demanded an end to Xenos sorcery that starves the emperor's chosen of his breath, while a lesser confessor from a mining world whispered on a private channel that his parishioners had slept through the night for the first time in 2 generations, and he had never heard a prayer so grateful as the sound of their snoring. It was in this sea of contradictions that Marshal Korath Vex arrived in system with a task force of battered troop carriers and lean, hungry escorts that wore the scars of a lifetime of war like regimental colours. He asked permission to come aboard the Eternal Vigilance and did not wait for it before docking. When Valthera met him at the airlock, the man filled the corridor not because he was large, though he was, but because he had learned how to occupy a room so that lesser storms broke upon him and ran away. "We fought together at Halcyon Rift," he said by way of greeting, as if it had been last week, rather than 15 years and 3 lifetimes ago. "You looked at the void and didn't blink. Good to see you still have eyes. And you still have a fleet," Valthera replied, letting him set the rules for the first minute, because it cost her nothing and gained her truth. "Governor Thaddeus Vex is yours." "Blood," Korath said with a sour twist of the mouth. "5th cousin thrice removed, which is to say close enough to share a name and a scandal. He'll sell his world for peace or sell peace for his world, and I cannot decide which bargain is uglier." They walked to the strategium where the hololith drew constellations of politics brighter than stars. Korath traced a finger through the void, bringing up sectors with a gesture, adding figures with a grunt. "Here," he said, pointing to a cluster of perpetually besieged shrine worlds. "Every month I send regiments to die so that fanatics can sing. They'll beg for inclusion, because safety feels like righteousness when you're tired enough. Here." He swept over a navigational artery whose houses carried pride like armor. "You cut this with your quiet, and the Imperium becomes a map of small wars. My soldiers stop being a wall against hell and start being policemen at 10,000 customs posts." "You want the null to grow," Valthera said, "and also never to have been invented." "I want a weapon I can aim," he answered. "And I want a government that remains one thing when you wake it up. The moment we admit we cannot fight everything everywhere, the moment we let a Xenos peace save us, all the component kingdoms remember they prefer their own songs. Then we're no longer an Imperium. We're a choir with 1,000 conductors and no hymn." He looked tired when he finished, not because he doubted any word he'd spoken, but because conviction eats a man as thoroughly as war. "My sergeants report soldiers who no longer fear possession," he said more softly. "They sleep. They smile. They make jokes with 2 layers again. But my officers report supply lines that will snap if navigators cannot see. And my chaplains report congregations who cannot feel the Emperor's hand as readily. If I choose the quiet, I betray the idea that kept us alive. If I choose the storm, I betray the people who will die." "Then we must stop choosing alone," Valthera said. He gave her a long look, weighing parts of her she rarely let anyone see. "I heard the Xenos leader offered parley." "He did," she answered. "He presents himself as a rational tyrant. He calls himself a protector without needing to say from what. He sent a greeting in perfect Gothic and asked for answers I don't think either of us can give." Korath's knuckles cracked. "Then we make answers in a room he cannot own." On Cole, Serath. Ethan Sable watched the messages ripple across 1,000 channels and understood something that would have been denied to him if he still possessed a mortal heartbeat. The Imperium was already negotiating with itself. His enemies, within that vast cathedral of contradictions, were arguing with his allies. His allies were arguing with each other about whether they were allowed to exist. He did not need to conquer the Imperium. He needed to offer it a mirror that let it admire its fractures. Magos Zerion presented casualty projections and logistics curves that glittered with self-satisfaction. If the null proliferation proceeds at current speed, localized famine events will occur in 6 sectors due to navigational disruptions. However, demonic incidents will drop to 0 across 43 worlds. Net survival gain, 15 billion over 30 years. Cultural indicators remain outside normative parameters. Era Nullborn stood in the shadow of the Hall of Echoes with a child's hand wrapped around 2 of her fingers. Ilior leaned into the silence like a climber feeling the wind, his eyes bright with the kind of questions that did not fit in the Magos' models. "They want to talk," she said to Ethan without turning, because she had decided he could bear honesty only if it arrived as simple fact. Talking is a door. Doors let you in and out. Locks are decisions. Don't love the lock more than the door. Ethan finished composing the message he had been writing in his head since he awoke in metal. He named the proposal with a word that carried the right weight without pretending to be a promise. Argent, for the cold shine of living metal and the pale light of compromise. Compact, not treaty. An agreement understood to be brittle, beautiful, and made under pressure. He sent the draft not as a demand, but as a question with terms attached. A pilot corridor of silence along the Velthara Reach, where Imperial worlds could opt in. Guaranteed navigation beacons maintained by Necron geometries, and oversight by a joint council with equal seats for mortal and immortal. In exchange, a halt to null expansion beyond pre-agreed boundaries while the experiment lived. The replies came like weather. The Navi's nobilité howled in all the languages money speaks. The ecclesiarchy split itself in 2 and called both halves victory. The Munitorum asked for maps and timetables and, almost shyly, for a chance to rest a handful of regiments without inviting annihilation. The High Lords did not speak with one voice. They seldom did. But Velthara's authority as Ordo Malleus, combined with Korath's contingents and the immediate relief in Velthara itself, created enough mass for an orbit. "You will be called traitor," Korath warned her in the Strategium. "If this fails, your name will be instruction for children about the dangers of thought. If it succeeds, they will erase you and pretend the compact signed itself." "Then I must take comfort," Velthara said with a thin smile, "in the fact that the Emperor and I have chosen similar reputations." She assembled her delegation without pomp. 2 scribes whose meaning outweighed their titles, a chaplain whose faith did not require volume, an astropath rendered ordinary by the null, but carried on a litter for what he had been, and Jorik Voss, who insisted on coming to the threshold even if he could not step beyond it. "I will listen," he told her, fingertips trembling over the air like a man reading Braille in wind. "Even here, at the edge, I can hear what the quiet does to people." Korath did not accompany them planetside. He remained where his duty lived, arranging ships into patterns that meant, "I will not be surprised." He sent a single token with Velthara, a battered regimental standard from the Halcyon Rift campaign, its colours repaired a dozen times, its prayers worn smooth by calloused hands. "If they mock it, we walk," he said. "If they respect it, we can talk." The Hall of Echoes welcomed them with soundless aplomb, its arches curving like the inside of a bell tuned for thought. Era greeted them first, not with weapons held low, but with palms shown empty in a ritual that felt older than war. Behind her, Ilior watched with the alert solemnity of a child, convinced that grown-ups are playing a game whose rules were made for taller people. "Welcome," Era said. "We ask that you leave behind what cannot speak for itself." She nodded toward the standard. "That may enter." "It has earned a voice," Ethan followed, each step a study in a grace that had learned how to not threaten. He carried nothing that looked like a weapon, and everything that felt like power. "Inquisitor Veltera Keth," he said, letting the title stand in honor rather than challenge. "Marshal Korath Vex," he added to the empty air, because he understood the choreography of absences. "Shall we begin to define where the quiet ends and the songs begin?" Valtera presented the terms that had survived a hurricane of counsel. "A corridor," she said, "as you proposed. Opt-in worlds, protected from the warp and visited by Imperial auditors who cannot be turned away. Your null engine does not advance beyond agreed navigational beacons without joint consent. In return, we guarantee non-aggression, ceasefire across this theater, and the right of Imperial citizens to depart null zones if they choose. We will not consign unwilling souls to silence Zerion catalogued clauses and carve them into crystal, his mechadendrites writing as if the act could trap the future. Enforcement mechanisms," he said mildly, meaning leverage. "Witnesses," Valtera countered, meaning shame. Ira watched both of them and chose a third word. "Children," she said, because someone had to. Ethan inclined his head. "Argent Compact," he said, speaking the name aloud so it could begin to become true. "Ah, preliminary article. Neither side will exploit this corridor to strike the other. A second, either side may end the experiment with 30 days' notice, during which removal is orderly. A third, cultural liaisons will be exchanged. We will learn to pronounce each other without choking." Valtera extended her hand. It was gloved, not in fear of contamination, but in acknowledgement that their skins were not the same. Ethan mirrored the gesture with the ritual touch of an old court greeting that did not presume equivalence. In that contact, the first formal diplomatic link between the Imperium of Man and the Pariah Worlds became a thing that could be broken later, but not denied now. The regimental standard stirred in air that did not exist. Jorik Voss, standing at the threshold, wept without shame and whispered that the quiet had learned a new note. Ilior laughed once, a single bright syllable that made the vaulted ceiling remember how to carry song. Outside, ships rearranged themselves into patterns that meant watch instead of kill. Inside, words began to build a bridge whose weight limit no one could yet calculate. Silver and fragile and sufficient for a first step. They chose a world named Aegir's Gate, a moon garden tethered to a thin-blooded giant at the lapping edge of the null. From its hills, you could look up and see the boundary written into the sky, a pale aurora like moonlight poured into glass, where the warp's roiling hues met a tranquil pallor that endured their battering without insult. On one side of the horizon, astropaths could still feel the Emperor's distant warmth like a hand on their brows. On the other, the quiet held every thought as a lake holds stars, unbroken unless you chose to throw a stone. The amphitheatre had been carved into a caldera and roofed with lattice crystal. One half lay within the null and one half without, as if the builders had set a table with 2 seasons and bid their guest choose a chair. Imperial banners hung beside geometries that were not flags, but the visualized grammar of a language that preferred axioms to anthems. The air smelled faintly of rain that would never arrive. Inquisitor Valtera Keth stood on the threshold and felt the division pass along her spine. In the quiet half, the thin ache behind her eyes ceased. That constant pressure from 1,000 souls crying out for a fraction of a second across impossible distance. In the living half, where warp currents still tease the senses, prayer had weight. She could stand in either. Neither would be home. Marshal Korath Vex took a seat that let him watch the doors and the ceiling both. His coat, scorched and restitched along the hem, lay across his shoulders like a promise he would not make twice. To his right, Navigator Jorik Voss sat erect, despite the bandage across his third eye, his fingers resting on the arm of the chair, as if reading a script only he could sense. Near them stood a priest too young to be, cynical and too scarred to be naive, a handful of scribes who measured words in the weight of their consequences, and a detachment of guardsmen who pretended their hands did not itch for familiar steel. Ethan's sable arrived without fanfare. Shadows folded and returned him not as an apparition, but as a fact. He crossed into the living half of the hall with a palpable effort, as if the warp's breath rasped against metal lungs that had no use for air. Ira came beside him, like an answered question, the quiet deepening where she passed as though trying to match her stride. Elior walked between them in a plain tunic, small fingers grasping a wooden toy whose rings defied simple separation. "Counsel," Ethan said, and made the word respectful without making it subservient. "You asked for a table. We have set one." "We asked for a choice," Valtera answered, and inclined her head the precise amount required to honor a sovereign whose sovereignty she did not recognize. "The table is a beginning." Korath's gaze flicked to the boy, then away, then back with the stubbornness of a man who had resolved never to be disarmed by affection again, and found himself in danger of it nonetheless. "That is new," he said flatly, meaning Elior. "Alive," Era corrected, as if it mattered to fate that someone choose the proper adjective. "New comes whether we call it or not." Alive is a decision. Jorik Voss bowed his head in the direction of Ilior's footsteps. "Did you dream?" he asked the boy with courtly seriousness, because his own dreams had always been a battlefield he crossed to perform a duty no one else could. Elior considered. "I had pictures that didn't wait their turn," he said, frowning with the effort of accurate description. "They didn't bite. They didn't ask. They were there. Is that a dream?" "It might be a beginning," Jorik murmured, and something uncoiled in his hands. They took their places along the curve where silence and song met. The first speeches were made with the practiced care of people who understood that opening moves are remembered long after victories are forgotten. Valtera spoke first because the Imperium had asked the question, and she acknowledged the courtesy of being allowed to answer before she was prosecuted for asking. "We have found waters that drown our devils," she said. "We have also found they drown our choirs. I do not pretend to hold the line between those losses in my palm. I will ask this instead. Do we have the right to impose suffering if we name it freedom, or the right to impose silence if we name it peace? Does a world belong to the billion lives on it, or to the idea they are told to die for?" Ethan's reply came like the tide, inexorable, because it did not hate the shore it erased. "When the house is burning, do you ask the fire if it consents to water? The warp is not a metaphor, but a predator. Your courage is a virtue. Your stubbornness is a sacrament to that predator. I am offering absence where it feeds. The price is high. So is the price of generations devoured." Korath shook his head, not in denial, but in recognition of the way two truths can make a quarrel look like a solution. "If you take away the abyss, we forget how to build bridges," he said. I have led regiments of men and women who chose to stand at the edge and make a wall of themselves so the rest could sleep. The price of that choice is the right to make it. Take that away, and you turn us into livestock tended by an immortal shepherd with good intentions and no heirs. Era's gaze slid from one speaker to the next, her expression more measuring than judgmental. I grew up in noise that would kill most, she said softly. Then I lived in a quiet that would starve some. The question is not whether we prefer one to the other. The question is whether we can teach ourselves to move between them without losing who we are on either shore. Construct the hush where it saves lives, and build doors through it so that life can go on being louder than safety when it must. Doors, murmured the young priest, unable to stop himself. We could call them chapels. Call them corridors, Jorik said, dry humour threading weariness. Your gods and my houses both love a threshold. Zerion, who had been silent long enough to be mistaken for a statue, unfurled a mechadendrite with the satisfaction of a man reclaiming his terrain. The Argent Compact is a test, he said, not of faith, not of courage, but of logistics. Corridor beacons, oversight, withdrawal protocols. I am interested in whether this works. Your philosophies are epiphenomena of systems. If the system holds, the epiphenomena will sing properly, whether they want to or not. You have no use for consent except as a variable, Valthara observed. I have the only use for consent that matters, Zerion replied, a number that improves survival. Ilio, who had been rotating the twin rings, looked up at that. Sometimes you twist the wrong way first, he said patiently. It doesn't mean you were wrong. It means you are learning where the not doors are. The line made a path through the room, like sunlight into a cloister. Even Korath's mouth betrayed him with the ghost of a smile. Ethan rested a hand briefly on the back of Ilio's chair in a gesture that could have been reassurance or the seeking of it. They moved from preambles to terms, witnesses and liaisons, the right to depart, the right to refuse. The speed of expansion measured not in light years, but in funerals avoided and songs preserved. Valthara insisted on auditors without fear of disappearance. Ethan insisted on beacons placed by his people so that the silence would be clean, not a patchwork open to sabotage. Korath demanded the corridor not become a highway for the slow bleeding of imperial unity. Era proposed council seats for those who did not fit cleanly in either choir. Blanks, pariahs, the unhearers whose existence had been an embarrassment until now. Every time they approached agreement, a fear rose and set teeth to it. Every time fear threatened to make the work impossible, someone, usually Era, occasionally Jorik, once Ilio, found a word that returned them to the task. It did not feel like peace. It felt like labor, the old kind that leaves calluses you can be proud of. Midway through the fourth clause, the hall's living half shuddered with a ripple like heat on stone. The astropath attendant, seated beyond the quiet with prayer scrolls bound to his wrists out of habit rather than utility, jerked as if a string had been snapped inside him. He gasped a wordless warning as the crystal lattice overhead showed new constellations, flaring points in geometries Valthara recognized with dread before the screen named them. Warp real space incursions, 6 simultaneous breaches. The map resolved into systems like campfires in a night suddenly crowded with cold. Worlds that had petitioned for entry into the compact but had not yet been threaded to the corridor. Worlds that had refused on principle and would now pay the clean price of principle in blood. Worlds no one had known existed because the galaxy was always larger than anyone's map. The Screaming Crown, Korath said. reading the signatures like the name of an old enemy on a wall of the dead. We broke his fleet at Halcyon Rift. He will repay with interest. Velthera's vox clicked twice, a code that meant orders were arriving. She did not need to open the channel to know their flavor. Withdraw, delay, strike on the Xenos while they were distracted. Save what could be saved, that war and Aquila. Forget the rest, because there had to be lines somewhere. Even if the lines were a confession none of them ever believed they would make. Ethan did not turn to her. He was already seeing the null diagrams in his head, already measuring distance and cost. "I can extend the field," he said, and each syllable was a blade shaving time off a decision. Not to all 6, to 3. If I do it, the compact's boundaries will be broken before their ink is dry. If I do not, tens of millions will die this hour, and the rest in the next. If you do, Korath said, you teach the galaxy that treaties are intentions, not constraints. If you do not, Era said, you teach the child that principles are what adults say when they do not have to bleed. Ilio's hands tightened on the rings. "Doors," he said, frightened and furious that the rings would not teach him a trick he could offer like a talisman. "Please, make a door." Jorik pushed himself to his feet, swaying as if the floor had tilted under a tide only he could feel. "The world where my house trains its youths is one of those stars," he said. "Half of me wants your silence to reach it. The other half wants us to survive the meaning of that reaching. I cannot reconcile them. I can only ask which failure leaves more room for tomorrow." The young priest had tears on his face. Without noticing, he had opened the gate that let them fall. "If 1,000,000 prayers become one door, my lord," he whispered to no one with a crown, "will you forgive us for how we choose to use it?" Velthera reached for the part of herself that had not belonged to any order and would be burned from the records if these walls ever spoke. She discovered it was still there and found that it had a voice. "Do it," she said to Ethan. And each word was a treason and a vow. "Break our agreement and save who you can. We will live with what that makes of us." Korath did not look at her as he cut new orders across a lattice that had always waited for this day. "We redeploy," he said, voice like boots on old stone. "We intercept where silence cannot arrive. We evacuate where it buys us hours. We do not desert the stubborn because surrender is only a death with better posture." Zerion was already moving calculations through crystal, his hands a storm that finally had something big enough for him to respect. Era squeezed Ilio's shoulder hard enough to anchor herself. Ethan closed his eyes, not to pray, but to choose a future he would be blamed for and accept the blaming as his penance. The council shattered into motion, not with the discord of failure, but with the urgency of a fire brigade that had been arguing water pressure and now had to pick up buckets. The negotiations did not end. They were suspended over a chasm bridged by a rope labeled later, held taut by hands that had learned enough about each other to want later to exist. Above Aegir's gate, the aurora at the boundary thickened, its pale light knotting as if an invisible hand gripped it. The quiet reached for 3 stars, like a mercy that knew it would be called theft by those it could not touch. Ilio watched the sky and did not blink, because someone needed to see the whole of it. He held the stubborn rings and whispered to them as if they were the hinges of a world, asking them to remember how doors are made. It began as a bruise on the sky and swelled into a wound. Across 6 systems the firmament rippled, color boiling out of nothing, vox choirs breaking into static as something vast pressed a hand against reality and pushed. The screaming crown came laughing, a storm of thrones and teeth, its coronet a ring of faces that had forgotten the difference between song and pain. Warp lightning curled around cathedral spires and manufactoria stacks. Statues of saints watched their shadows stagger and rise without their bodies. Where the silence met the storm, the boundary brightened to a pale, patient flame, glass refusing to shatter while the sea beat itself bloody against it. At Raichi's Minor, where House Voss trained its navigators to read the wind of the unseen, the first horn blew flat. Jorik Voss listened in the Eit Strategium and knew, without sight, which of his house's youths were kneeling in chapels they could not feel, and which were running toward ships that would never find the old roads. Hold, he told them across channels, that carried only personal loyalties now, and his voice steadied because there was nothing left to prop it up except itself. On Sancta Lys, the pilgrim world of 1,000 bells, the screaming crown pulled the sound out of brass and made it meet. The faithful gripped their beads and watched the air ripple with moving holes. A line of Cadian veterans under Marshal Korath Vex stood in front of a shrine's doors and did not fire until the demons could see the whites of their eyes. They had learned long ago that fear is a shape you can cut your blade along. Today, the blade rang against something that wanted to be a song. Ethan Sable, moved with the calm of an avalanche you had convinced yourself was a mountain. From the moon garden of Aegir's Gate to the orbital rails of Kol Serath, his commands threaded through geometries that did not require the warp's permission. Null pylons unfolded like monochrome flowers across 3 systems, the 3 he had chosen, the 3 he could save without breaking what fragile trust he had begun to build. Crystal obelisks rose from planet skin, humming, aligning, calling silence down like rain. Inquisition cruiser Eternal Vigilance, Valterra Keth said into the smoke of her own bridge. This is Keth. Accept Necron escort in the following formation. The words tasted like blasphemy and medicine. A flight of Crescent ships slid into place around the battered Gothic hull, their gravity wells knitting with the cruiser's wake in a pattern that made a corridor where none should exist. By the throne, muttered the lieutenant at her elbow, watching a Necron obelisk ship lock its shadow over their prow and take the brunt of a warp gust that would have peeled their Geller plating like fruit. We're flying under a Xenos parasol. Today, Valterra said, we prefer weather to fire. They dropped into the air above Sancta Lys through a storm that smelled like old blood in new snow. Ethan's ground phalanxes were already there, a grid of glossy obsidian bodies that advanced like the arguments of a patient god. Immortals stooped, green lightning spitting from gorse flares in hissing meditations. Lichguard held shields like doors that had learned to walk. The null field blossomed around them, clean, clinical, rejecting. Lesser demons came apart at the edge of it like breath in winter, unraveling into ash with a sigh that was almost relief. It should have been simple. It wasn't. The screaming crown understood tides. It slashed at the edges, poured power where the null was thin, manifested avatars just outside the hush, and hurled them inward like grapeshot. Warp leeches swam along power lines and bit pylons where their algorithms remapped too slowly. It sent whispers to mortals in the quiet, not with psychic teeth, but with memory sharpened into knives. One guardsman watched his dead wife step out of the smoke and ask why he thought peace should cost anyone else. He shot her, and then the real demon that wore her voice. He was steadier afterward. Within the hush, Imperial flamers coughed and failed where Prometheum could not accept a spark from a soul. Grenadiers cursed the way their rage slipped from them like oil from a glove. Sergeant Banners did not stir, but laser guns fired obediently and artillery derived satisfaction from Newton, where the warp would not play. Under Necron's shade, squads advanced by the book and survived, because the book was boring. Left flank will congeal, Korath said over a channel salted with grit, watching Vox feeds in a command trench that had been a processional 15 hours ago. You there, second company, stop trying to be heroes. You will counterpunch where they are dumb enough to collapse onto our rigidity. He keyed to another band. Pharaon, your third phalanx is holding at grid 7. Our scouts see a rip forming. If they leap, we'll open a hole behind them and roll them up. You'll want to pivot. Ethan's reply was a measured pause and then a shift in formation. You could have measured with a microscope. Your suggestion aligns with survivability. Proceed. It was not praise. It contained respect. Valtera stood where she could see both the hololith and the stained glass, where a saint refused to burn. Era was beside her, a shadow of calm that cut a breathing space for mortals to think in. If you move that pylon 5 degrees, Era said to Ethan through a private channel, the field will cross the square without drowning the hospital. You are certain. I am certain you will have to trust doubt, she answered. The dead will be angry if you save them by killing them. Ethan pivoted the pylon. The hospital windows blew out in silence and then stopped shaking. Half an hour later, the surgeon working by lantern light would only remember that his hand had begun to obey him again. On Rachis Minor, the Screaming Crown chose theatre. It came as a choir of crowns, each one a loop of screaming mouths, held up by hands that were wrists only on one side. It spoke through blood vapor and told jokes about courage that made people laugh as they wept. Imperial stormtroopers tried to flank and found the ground folding into a stair that led sideways. Necron Praetorians launched on vector-straight wings and were caught in gossamer that wasn't there. Adapt, Valtera snapped at a squad leader as his comms clipped with panic. Not around it, through it. Grenades behind you. Blow your own wake. If the world insists on folding, give it a hinge. The squad did as ordered, detonating a backwash that wrote an exit into the air. The Praetorians took the hint, not by understanding, but because Ethan re-weighted their pattern recognition to accept human anomaly as vector correction. The rigid line bent, and where it bent, it did not break. Naval fire turned slow and exact. The Eternal Vigilance's lances stitched careful lines between cathedrals and crowd, burning holes in the air that bled warp back into itself. Necron crescent craft hung like parasitic moons and shed gravity nets that made demons heavy. In one orbit, a crown shard reached for the Vigilance's bridge. Ethan's flagship shifted a hair and let his shadow bite it first. You could have let them have me, Valtera said afterward, voice dry and quiet as dust. I am not saving you, Ethan replied. I am preserving the conversation. Pretend it's the former, she said, for morale. He did not answer, but one of his phalanxes moved to hold ground her troops could not. Sometimes mercy is indistinguishable from calculation from a distance measured in 2 battlefields. On the ridge above Sancta Lys, Korath lit a cigar he did not intend to finish. Around him, men and women watched the null like farmers watching rain swallow fire. You, he said, pointing at a tech priest who was cataloguing miracles while they fell. Tell your drones to run lines for those pylons. They'll bite you. They are not wired for binary, the priest replied primly. Neither am I, Korath said, waving the cigar at the battle. We're making it work. Magos Zerion chimed in from an observation dais with the delight of a man watching numbers flirt with him. Fascinating. The null suppresses warp expression. Yet the screaming crown manifests at edges by exploiting topological imperfections, creases in the field. They are subtle. We can iron some. We cannot iron all. Then we put stitching where crease meets cut, Korath said. Veterans on the seams. They'll know how to hold a weird line. The screaming crown tested them with a noon that lasted 7 minutes too long. It thickened time, needing the extra width to pour more of itself through. Under that swollen hour, courage curdled into martyrdom. Era walked the line and brought people back from the edge by insisting on small tasks. Drink water, tie this knot. Breathe until I finish counting. Blanks are not inspiring. They are steadying. Today, steadying saved more than speeches. At Ratchis, the crown spoke to Ethan in voices he had loved. It used Ilya's laughter and made it brittle, offered it back if he would open the door wider. It offered him a galaxy without pain if he would accept a book with one story. He remembered a garden under a red sky and chose again to be hated. Now, Valtera said on the shared command channel, because there comes a point in every flood where the rescuers must push into the current, not away. Crown elements clustered at vectors 2 and 9. We faint with armor in the seam, pull them down the choke, and you, this to Ethan, drop the field for 3 seconds at the throat and slam it back. Give them water, then give them glass, collateral. Less than leaving them a hallway to our dead, she said. Trust me. For once, Ethan trusted. The phalanxes opened like curtains. Chimera transports and Lehman Rust tanks roared into a gap that had not existed and became bait with better armor. The crown surged, greedy. On account that Korath kept with a litany older than his regiment, the null field dipped and rose. For 3 heartbeats, the demons tasted a sky they could breathe and drank it so deep they could not spit it out when the hush returned. Half the surge froze into ash, mid-laugh. The other half staggered and showed how messy their insides were. It did not kill the screaming crown. Nothing that neat exists. But it made a wound that meant later instead of now. The prince coalesced above a basilica into a form like a man who had swallowed an empire and not liked the taste. Its crown of faces howled as one. Break your glass, little king, it told Ethan, or I will break your toys until you learn how to weep in metal. Return to your ocean, Ethan said, and activated a pattern older than stars. Quantum cages unfolded like origami folded too tightly to reopen. They clamped around the avatar for a breath, long enough for the Vigilance's lances to write a scar into its chest. It ripped free and fled. It would need to remember how to be brave in pieces now. By sundown, an arbitrary marker chosen by men and women who needed the ritual, 3 systems held. Sanctalis counted its bells and found enough left to sing the hour. Ratchis Minor put out altar fires that had begun to burn backward. The third, Dalis Utrame, lost a continent and saved the other 4. The other 3 systems that the null could not reach sent no more messages. Sometimes subtraction is all a ledger knows how to record. On the field below the basilica, guardsmen stacked weapons and bodies with the same care. Necron warriors stood like statues whose sculptor had gone to lunch and might be back. Children came out with buckets. Priests came out with bandages. Era washed blood from her hands and did not look at the water. Valtera sat on a step and let the ache behind her eyes return. It would be there as long as there were people left to call for help. Ethan approached without ceremony. Your improvisation, he said to Valtera, nodding at the place where their trap had sprung, created a solution my models did not find. My rigidity held ground. Your courage would have bled away. Please do not make me say more than that. Please don't make me need you as badly as I do, she replied, and surprised herself by not spitting after. Korath limped up, cigar gone, voice reduced to gravel that had been walked on. We held, he said, like a man reporting the weather. At a price that buys tomorrow. Tomorrow is how empires happen or stop happening. Ethan looked toward the sky, where the aurora still brightened at the edge of the world, glass and sea in love with their own argument. Tomorrow, he said, and behind his careful tone, something ancient stirred. Hope or worry, that hope still existed. They turned together toward maps that would need new colors. The crimson tide receded, leaving stains that would not wash out. The silence held, but it had learned to bend where mortal hands asked it to. Somewhere, far away and too close, the screaming crown laughed like a wound being stitched by someone with shaking hands. After the bells stopped, Sister Edda learned to count in breaths. She wiped soot from the brass mouths of Sancta Lys's great chimes and listened to their silence like a penance she had chosen. The plaza below was a quilt of sleeping soldiers and weeping mothers. Above, the sky wore a pale seam where the quiet pressed against the world's old music. When the first relief ship failed to arrive, Edda stood in the doorway of the basilica and told the gathered crowd that the emperor's voice was not gone, only hushed, and that perhaps faith had always been the art of hearing through other sounds. A little boy asked whether the bells would dream again. She did not lie. She told him there were other ways to sing. Trooper Anna Vele of the Cadian 47th wrote a letter she could not send. Your son will not be taken by the whisperers, she began, and the words hurt less than yesterday. He sleeps with both eyes closed now. He laughs in his sleep. I do not. She listed the names of those who would not wake, and then folded the paper into the cuff of her glove, where it would not be lost when the next alarm came. In the null, there were no astropaths to taste the thoughts of the grieving and carry them across light years. The quiet had saved her life and stolen her postmark. At Ratchis Minor, a youth of House Voss named Cassian walked the cloisters with his hands clenched behind his back to stop them from reaching instinctively for a third sight that could not open. The training tower's windows looked out on the threshold where the aurora held the sea of souls at bay. He could stand on the steps and feel his mind become his own. Inside, the elders of his house spoke of duty like a spell that needed repeating, and of dwindling contracts, and of what a navigator was when the sky refused to ripple. Cassian chose the steps. He had never imagined that peace would feel like treason. The victory had been real, but victories that matter are always wrong in details no chant can smooth. Sancta Lys and Ratchis Minor and Dallis Outremer still turned in their orbits. Their people lived to discover which habits grief would make permanent. But ships at the edge of the new silence found their routes unthreaded. Navigators could not see lanes where the warp would not oblige. Quotas were recalculated around islands. Hungry worlds measured ration shipments in weeks instead of days, and some found that weeks were not a number they possessed. On Kol, Serath, the Hall of Echoes filled with the sound of numbers biting. Magos Xerion presented models on panes of crystal that floated like verdicts. Hybrid tactics reduced Imperial casualties by 32% across the 3 primary engagements, he said, each numeral a bell rung with admiration for itself. Null field deployment prevented demonic saturation events in all ground theatres. However, the word landed like a blade laid on the table rather than raised. The modulation required to coordinate with Imperial civilian infrastructure introduced imperfections in the field. edge crease density increased by 8%. We observed exploitation vectors at 5 sites. Furthermore, expansion rate of the Silent March has slowed by 17% over the last cycle due to redeployment of assets for joint operations. Ethan stood with his hands behind his back, head inclined as if listening to the hum in stone. Define vulnerabilities. Doors, Zerion replied, the syllable dry enough to burn. Every door is a seam. We created corridors through which your allies could breathe. The enemy learned to lick the hinges. Additionally, the pact requires oversight delays. 3 worlds are within reach now, but our agreed calendar. He flicked a finger and the calendar appeared. A lattice of restraint prevents immediate annexation. Ira did not flinch from her own word turned like a knife. We did not build doors to invite wolves, she said. We built them because people need to leave a house sometimes and watch the street. The answer to wolves is not to brick the windows. Your metaphor may be beautiful, Zerion said, but wolves are not persuaded. Before Ethan could reply, a new voice cut the air like polished malice. And yet we persisted in laying meat on the threshold. Overlord Trazyn the Infinite observed as he strolled into the hall with the unhurried charm of a man who had never been told no in any voice he considered binding. His body gleamed in Baroque plates, his staff's head a museum of stolen elegies. Where Zerion's enthusiasm smelled of oil, Trazyn's amusement smelled of dust that had once been a crown. You were expected yesterday, Ira said, moving a fraction to place herself where Ilior, permitted to watch from a balcony's shadow, could see her first before anyone else. I was here yesterday, Trazyn replied, in a gallery beneath your feet, speaking with kings who do not answer anymore but have never quite learned the trick of silence. One of them reminded me of a maxim. Bargains made in fear read like surrender when the ink dries. He paced the mirror-lit aisle and let himself admire the reflections. Argent compact, he said, savouring the vowels as if they tasted of a wine he would never drink. The phrase has the proper ring of fragility. What a pity to hang eternity on such string Ethan's voice would not bend. Speak your objection plainly, Trazyn. 2 objections then, so that the audience remains awake, Trazyn said cheerfully. First, your cooperation with the Imperium weakens our position. They have learned to stand in our shade and will soon decide they planted the tree. Second, you are compromising the aim you set us, an empire quiet enough to outlast the screaming. You slow the march to guide infants across the road. You tilt pylons to save hospitals. You open doors because a mortal woman told you stories need them. He tipped his staff toward Era with a courtly gesture that managed to be a compliment and an insult in the same breath. I appreciate a curator's care. But artifacts do not arrange the museum. We do. If we are that museum, Era said, you have made a habit of stealing from the gift shop. Trazyn's eyes burned with a smile, and placing the objects where they are truly appreciated. May I? His chin indicated the balcony's shadow. No, Ethan and Ira said together. Ilia's wooden rings clicked once, the sound small and certain as a bird finding its branch. Trazyn's next words were forged without malice, and so cut deeper. Some of the dynasties whisper that you are risking everything for a child's laugh, he told Ethan. They are unkind. I do not think it is the child. I think it is your own memory of the man who made a choice and killed his people into a different shape. You are tired of being that man. You have chosen the comfort of being contradicted by mortals who die before they bore you. Era stepped forward, before anyone asked her to. If you try to use him to pry open a leadership challenge, you will learn how loud the quiet can be. Trazin inclined his head, irony softening into something that might almost have been respect. I admire your devotion, human. It would make a fine exhibit. I will not touch the boy. I will, however, go now and ask those who remember the old oaths whether we wish to be ruled by an apology. He turned on a heel engraved with histories and was gone with the same casualness he had arrived, leaving calculations and anger to breed unhelpfully. Ethon exhaled a breath, no lungs required. Proceed, Magos. Zerion did, delighted to return to the safety of numbers. To mitigate creases, we can reweight field algorithms away from human corridors. To regain expansion speed, we reassign 2 obelisk arrays from protection duty to frontier work. Risk increase to allied worlds, non-zero. Benefit to long-term objective. Statistically significant, the worlds we saved will not move, Era said. They cannot move. If we pull shade from their edges now, we explain the math to mothers with empty homes. Mathematics explains itself, Zerion replied. That is not how grief learns, she said. In orbit above Ager's gate, the eternal vigilance's strategium smelled of ozone and unwashed courage. Valthera Keth stood with a sheaf of orders that contradicted themselves so efficiently they formed a perfect circle. The Lord Militant of the Segmentum demanded immediate disengagement from Xenos operations and a redeployment to protect warp lanes. The conclave of the Ordo Hereticus forwarded a question wrapped like a dagger. Had she, in her zeal, elevated a Necron lord to the status of ally? A scrawl from a planetary synod petitioned with humility for the corridor to extend to their worlds before the next storm. A private line from an old mentor asked what it felt like to betray your younger self. The Navis Nobilite sent a letter that pretended to be law. Marshal Korath Vex listened to the litany without flinching. Half want you to shake his hand again, he said. Half want you to cut it off and show them the trophy. The half that wants the trophy will deny ever wanting it if the war goes poorly. Which do you want? Valthera asked. A map I can still understand tomorrow, Korath said bluntly. The corridor is a map. I don't care if a Xenos wrote it with us. It keeps my regiments from drowning. Jorik Voss sat in a chair near the threshold line, where the warp still prickled as a rumour. His bandage was off. His third eye looked inward at a sky it could no longer read without pain. My house has sent me a formal censure, he said, with the exhausted humour of a man who had found the bottom of a barrel and dug for more. If I continue to counsel acceptance of null corridors, I forfeit certain privileges that make men bow. I prefer standing. I will remain. You will be called apostate, Valthera warned absently, already composing 2 replies in her head and promising to send one. I will be called happy, Jorik said. That is a novelty I intend to cultivate. Valthera took a pen, not because ink mattered in a galaxy of signals, but because ritual did. She drafted a reply to the Lord Militant that accepted oversight while refusing recall under the clauses she herself had written into the compact. She drafted a reply to the Ordo Hereticus that read like obedience and meant delay. She drafted a message to Ethan that was not sent. If they order me to kill you, I will not. If they order me to leave, I may anyway. If they order me to become simple, I will forget how. On the streets of Sanctalis, lines formed at the departure point they called the Bright Door, a beacon site where Imperial vessels could still make the approach and depart along a corridor that would one day be wider if promises survived their authors. People chose with a terrible intimacy of consequence, remain in safety and be cut from the web, or go back into the singing storm and keep your cousins in your life. A baker packed her oven into crates and told her husband she would send bread by the slice across years. A scribe refused to leave a mother who had just learned the quiet eased her pain. His brother called him coward and kissed him anyway. In a small courtyard where the light fell cleanly, Ilior asked Era a question she could not pass to anyone else. "Why is the quiet not for everyone?" he said, voice troubled by justice. "Why do doors only open where the map says yes?" "Because doors cost wood," Era said, crouching so her eyes met his, "and time, and people to stand and hold them for those who cannot lift the latch." "Then we should make more people," he replied, fierce with the solvable precision of a child. "We are trying," she said, and ruffled his hair because physical reassurance had learned how to be a language in her hands. Ethon watched them from a balcony they had named without naming. Shelter, if they needed it. He felt the pull of his own divided oath, to preserve a future that could not be corrupted by the warp, and to answer a boy's questions in good faith, even when good faith would slow the engine that made the future possible. He had not foreseen this arithmetic when he traded flesh for certainty. The metal did not help with sums that required mercy. "Overlord Trazin has departed Kol Serath," Selk reported. "Vectors suggest rendezvous with 2 dynastic flotillas. Messaging opaque, tone courtly." "He is calling the museum tour," Ira said. "The kind where the guide tells you what you're looking at before you know what it means." "Let him," Ethan said. Too quickly for anyone but Era to notice, it was not indifference. "We are not a monastery that can be kept by vows alone." "Then shore your vows with people," she murmured. Night fell on Aegir's gate because someone turned down the lights. In the Vigilance's chapel-turned-wardroom, Valthara and Korath shared a bottle that had crossed 3 crusades and tasted like stories that would never finish. "If they recall you," he said, "will you go?" "If I do not, they will call me traitor and be right," she said. "If I do, I will abandon a bridge we just learned how to build." "Might as well ask me whether I prefer my left hand or my right," he grunted. "I'll keep the corridor open as long as my engines run." "Do," she said softly, and did not tell him about the sealed writ in her pocket with her name on it and the word censure spelled in letters that felt like frost. Ethan stood alone with the Null Engine's song in his bones and made a promise he had no right to make. "We will hold the door," he told no one and everyone. "We will learn to do it without teaching wolves how hinges work." In the quiet that followed, a light on a console blinked with the stubborn rhythm of an unsanctioned transmission. Era saw it first, and her eyes narrowed the way a hunter's do when the trail refuses to be innocent. She said nothing. Some truths require choosing when to know them. Across the seam of the sky, the aurora held. Below it, the living made lists of the dead, of the repairs, of the reasons to stay, of the reasons to go. The price of victory was written in those columns, and in the silence that came after the tally, and in the way they picked up the pen again anyway. The Null Engine missed a beat. It was a small failure, the kind that does not announce itself with alarms, only with a difference you feel before you can name. Era felt it in the bones behind her ears, in the way the air between pylons seemed to thicken and then forgive itself. She turned to the console where unslept numbers flowed like an obedient river and watched a ripple cross the surface. A perfect progression interrupted by a single decimal place humming out of tune. The light at the corner of the panel blinked again, the same stubborn pulse she had seen the night after the battle and chosen not to acknowledge. Some truths require choosing when to know them. She chose now. Her fingers moved with the precise gentleness of someone disarming a trap without admitting it is a trap. The blinking resolved into a maintenance ping, signed by a code key that had never existed until it was needed. The message was not a message. It was a prayer sung in a language of metal, a Binharic hymn disguised as diagnostics. As she opened it, the null engine's hum wrote faint letters along her skin. Welcome. Initiate of the proper conclusion. Ara exhaled and let the silence in her blood press against the song. The hymn faltered, not from pain, but from respect for absence, and she followed the path it revealed. Logs unfolded, field telemetry, variance reports. At 6 moments during the battle, the null had lifted by a breath so small only machines and children would notice. Those lifts corresponded to the worst surges of the Screaming Crown. She asked the system for the author, and it gave her a name that felt like a blade set gently on the back of her neck. Magos Zerion. She did not go to Ethan. She did not call for guards. She went to the place where Zerion kept his prayers. The Magos' personal sanctum lay 2 levels below the Hall of Echoes, a chapel-temple hybrid built of polished obsidian and extruded logic. A dozen archive sarcophagi lined the walls, each the color of old teeth. In the center stood an altar of glass, under which equations crawled like fireflies. Zerion knelt there, head bowed, mechadendrites folded in a pose that mimicked humility with unnerving accuracy. The candle before him burned with a cold flame that did not consume its wax. He did not look up when Era entered. His senses would have seen her at the threshold and marked her lack of signature as a signature of its own. "You found the hinge," he said. "Good." She circled him once, keeping her hands loose, resisting the impulse to put them in fists. "You widened the creases during the assault," she said. 6 times. "You widened them and waited to see how the enemy would learn the seam. I corrected for the Emperor's absence," he replied, as if that were the kind of sentence that did not require a burial. The data from a pure field is valuable. The data from a stressed one is necessary. No artificial environment survives the surprise of reality otherwise. And reality is the thing you manufacture in your laboratory, she said softly. It is the thing we cannot afford to sentimentalize, Zerion corrected. And now he stood, gathering robes and limbs around himself with tidy irritation. "I expected you first, Era Nullborn. The Farron would forgive me and call it strategy. The Inquisitor would arrest me and call it politics. You are the only one with the power to stand in this room and make this conversation unable to lie." "You have been speaking to someone," Era said, letting the line trail like bait. "Your hymn is not native to our halls." He almost smiled. "There are others who understand that the warp is a tolerated pathology, not a theology. The Luminarch Synod on Carmentis Prime, the Divisio Mandati of Sotha Lacrim, the Cantoric Forge on Iapetus, where men and women with the proper auguries have begun to sketch engines that will make navigators sentimental artifacts." He spread his hands, as if displaying a well-ordered shelf. They requested fellowship. I granted it. We have obligations to those who will inherit the tools we make. "You mean to those who will build an empire of glass and call it strength," Ira said. "You mean to those who will stand where you stand and pretend not to hear the people dying on the stair below." Zerion's remaining organic eye blinked. It looked tired suddenly. A man's thing, not a machine's. "I widened the field by 3% at the edges," he said. "Not to kill. To learn. The Screaming Crown taught us more in those glances than a century of simulations would. We prevented saturation. You prevented saturation. My adjustments cost lives, yes. All choices cost lives. I made the cheaper choice." "You made the choice that let you be right later," she said. "I made the choice that will save billions later," he answered, and for the first time, something like heat touched his voice. Look at the model if you will not look at my face. The hybrid tactics you favor slow the march. They also make it resilient. We are discovering that resiliency now because I forced the system to absorb damage too early. We will be grateful for this sin. You will be grateful. Elio will grow up in the quiet because I sharpened the knife that kills the screams. Era stepped closer until his sensor arrays flickered in confusion. The near absence she carried distorted his readings, pulling his baselines off their altars. Do not speak his name because you have forgotten how to count without faces, she said. You are not allowed the currency of his future. Mechadendrites rose, then lowered. The moment of unwise violence passed. I admire you, Zerion said. You are the only one in these halls who cannot be owned by the thing you serve. That makes you dangerous and necessary. It also makes you wrong in the end, because ends are tall and you are one person. She considered mercy and discovered it was not weak enough for this work. You will show me every node of your correspondence, she said. You will permit me to bleed your augury trees and cauterize their roots. And then you will come to the Hall of Echoes and explain yourself to a room where a child will listen. He inclined his head. If that is the price of staying useful. You may not stay, she replied. He smiled without moving his mouth, the expression manifesting in the angle of his shoulders and the ease with which he allowed fear to be absent. You will not exile me while the equations still require my hands. Your mercy is for later, when the war allows it. She did not cuff him on the way to the hall. She did not bind him. She walked at his side with the certainty of someone who knows how to break a machine without necessarily breaking the man inside it. Above Aegir's gate, Veltara Keth opened a sealed packet that smelled like old monasteries and fresh rust. The sigils were Martian, stamped in authority that believed itself co-equal with thrones. Magos Dominus Heliox Theta of Forge Carmentis congratulated her on her pragmatic engagement with emergent xenotechnology, ordered her, under the Treaty of Olympus Mons and all proper canticles, to secure null assets for Mechanicus custody, and warned her that failure to comply would result in disarticulation of supply harmonics. A ghost script hid beneath the main text. A cant boiled so thin, only long service taught you to taste it. Your authority is inconvenient. We will go around you if we must. Korath Vex read the text over her shoulder without asking permission, and made a sound a hunter makes when the wind changes. Your friends are telling you to betray your friends. They were never my friends, Valthera said, rolling the message into a cylinder that would not fit any drawer. They are the kind of allies who put their hands on your back to help you climb a ladder they are shaking. She sent 2 orders that would look boring in the log. One moved Mechanicus personnel attached to her fleet into separate quarters for doctrinal realignment. Another shifted the crew rosters on critical systems, replacing red robes with plain uniforms that did not sing to machine spirits with such confidence. She did not use the word purge. She did not need to. The men and women who served her read the shape of what she did and made it work. In the Hall of Echoes, Ethan listened to Era's report with his head lowered, and there was something in that posture that had nothing to do with defeat. He looked like a penitent, or a man learning humility because pride had burned itself down to light. You widened the field, he said to Azerion, whose data slate coughed equations like alibis. You betrayed my instructions in the compact. I served the purpose we all pretend to. Adore, Zerion replied. I did not consult you because consultation becomes permission when events require speed. I will accept sanctions. I will not accept descriptions of my work as sabotage in the language of heresy. Ethan turned away for a moment and spoke to a person who was not in the room. He spoke to the flesh self who had chosen biotransference because he could not watch his child die slowly. He spoke to the king who had commanded gods and learned what gods asked in return. He spoke to the Pharaoh who had built an engine that silenced the warp and discovered it silenced other things when it was hungry. "This is how empires rot," he said finally, voice level. "Not from enemies pressing the walls, but from one good intention overreaching the law until the law becomes an obstacle. I told myself that immortality required perfect function. I forgot that perfect function breeds perfect arrogance." Era waited. She had brought him here so that he would have to decide with his face uncovered. "Magos Zerion," Ethan said, turning. "By my authority, you are deprived of noospheric autonomy. Your augury trees will be severed. Your access to the engine will be removed. You will remain as a consultant under constant supervision until a tribunal assembles. If you attempt to communicate with your co-conspirators, I will unmake your mind with the same surgical precision you admire." Zerion bowed as if he had just been promoted. "Accepted." "No," Ilio said from the balcony's shadow, and his small voice cut every practice posture to ribbons. He had come because Era could not refuse him. He had come because some lessons will be learned whether adults plan them. "No, accepted," he added, because he had learned the word and was now sharpening it. "You hurt people to count better." Zerion looked up at the boy with the condescension of someone who has never seen a child as anything but a preliminary adult. "The hurt prevents worse hurt, little one." "Does that make it the kind we like?" Ilio asked, furious at a scale he could not yet pick up. "If the quiet saves people, and you made a hole to see whether the monsters would crawl faster, did you make a door for them? Or did you make a window and pretend you couldn't see through it?" Silence settled like snow. Even Xeroxed souls respect certain questions. "Take him," Ethan said to Selk, who had arrived with a file of silent warriors. "Strip what must be stripped. Keep what we cannot afford to lose. I will call the tribunal when we have air to breathe." Zerion went without struggle. Era walked beside him again and kept her hands empty. As they reached the door, he looked at her with his one human eye and let her see, briefly, what he had hidden even from himself. "They told me once," he said, "when the flesh was young, that I loved the problem more than the person. I corrected the flaw by making the problem about the person. I thought that was clever. It was simply more expensive." "Costs are honest," she said. "They do not let you pay with other people forever." When Era returned, Ethan did not look up. "I almost killed him," he said. "The way I did it in my head was beautiful." "You chose not to because you want to live with more than beautiful choices," she replied. "Sometimes justice is a door with a chair under the knob." "Valthara to Pharon," came the vox, thin with distance and contempt from someone else's machine. "We have a problem. Elements of the Adeptus Mechanicus are moving to assert custody of your null assets under Martian writ. They are sending a fleet to secure compliance. I can hold mine. I cannot hold theirs without firing on friends who stopped being that word an hour ago." Ethan looked at the ceiling. He had once believed that ceilings were for keeping out the weather. They also kept prayers from believing they had escaped. "Transmit their demand," he said. "Then transmit our refusal to the demand and our invitation to the council that will judge the Magos who made them a promise he could not keep." "You're calling witnesses," Valtara said, and there was gratitude in it she did not allow to become need. "I am building a door," Ethan said. "If they kick it in, we will all know what they thought they were saving." After the channel closed, Ilio crawled into Ira's lap, because there are times when bodies are better treaties than words. If someone lies to make a good thing happen, he said into her coat, does the good thing become a lie too? No, she said, stroking his hair, but it becomes fragile. It becomes something that breaks when people stop watching. Ethan heard that and knew she was not speaking to the child alone. He went to the balcony and looked down at the city that had learned to sleep without screams and learned to mourn without songs. He promised them, and the promise did not try to be beautiful. I will hold the quiet, he said, and I will hold the people who keep it honest, even when they are mine far out where the aurora drew a pale ring around Ager's sky. New lights pricked the darkness, ships burning red runes of Mars. In the sanctum below, a candle that did not consume itself guttered and went out, not because the wax had run dry, but because someone had opened a door and the draught refused to be polite. Aegir's gate wore the hush like a mantle as the tribunal assembled. The amphitheatre of 2 seasons, half in living warp breath, half in null pallor, filled with voices that tried not to sound like judgments. Red-robed Mechanicus envoys sat in a cluster that smelled faintly of sanctified oil and impatience. Imperial officers occupied the living side, where hymns could still sit on the air. Necron lords stood in geometries rather than rows, their stances as exacting as vows. Ira moved along the threshold like an old one, melody returning to a key. Ilya walked beside her, solemn as a button on a funeral coat, clutching his intertwined wooden rings. At the center, beneath the latticed crystal that divided sky from ceiling, Ethan Sable waited to ruin and repair a century with a sentence. Velteraketh began, because law prefers to be announced by those it does not own. We convene to hear the case of Magos Zerion, she said, voice steady enough to be borrowed. Allegations of unsanctioned modulation of null field parameters, collusion with off-theatre Mechanicus factions, and sacrificial calculus conducted without consent. Evidence has been entered. Witnesses will be called. We will proceed with... No, Ethan said quietly, and the negative found purchase in every ear. We will proceed, but not as if this were only a single man's transgression. Before you weigh his actions, you must know the weight I handed to his hands. Era's eyes flicked toward him, warning and assent at once. Korath Vex went very still, the way soldiers do when they sense an ambush. That is also a sermon. Jorik Voss, bandage removed, raised his head slightly, his third eye blind to the warp and newly keen to the room. I have used a name that is true enough to do work, Ethan said, stepping forward into the line where silence and song touched. I have worn it like armor and apology. It is not the name that built the house in which we stand. He reached up and touched the circlet of impossible geometry at his brow. The device dissolved into motes and then reassembled into a sigil none of the Imperials had seen alive, though their archives held its shape like a threat in a locked drawer. A shock travelled through the Necron ranks, a flicker of new-spheric exchange, a shifting of stance that meant recognition older than the Imperium and more binding than fear. I am not merely a Pharaon, he said. I am the Silent King. Words, titles, answered him without sound. Sovereign of dynasties, maker of the bargain, exile, traitor to gods, judge of his own guilt. In the living half of the hall, a priest crossed himself out of reflex and then out of thought. Valthera's breath left to her, as if someone had revised the room's gravity and forgotten to tell her bones. Ira did not flinch. She had seen this truth standing behind his eyes, the way a mountain stands behind a hill and waits for maps to grow up. Ilior looked up at his father and whispered, because some questions deserve small voices. Is that a big king or a quiet king? Both, Ethan answered, and the answer did not try to be kind, especially the part that should not be a king at all. He bowed his head, not as a plea, but as a way of laying a blade on the ground. I made the bargain with the Citan, he said, and the room remembered the star gods the way old wounds remember weather. I led my people from flesh into metal. I chose immortality in the face of a storm that ate our children in their beds. I opened the door to salvation and invited annihilation with the same breath. The flashback was not a vision, but he spoke it so precisely that the air adopted its colors. He remembered the sky over his birth world, gorgeous and murderous with auroras. He remembered council chambers full of scholars with hands that shook over maps that promised none of the right lies. He remembered the star gods, their bodies like folded dawns, their voices like comfort's aftertaste. He remembered the instruments of biotransference, the tables, the waiting vessels, the promises of joy without ache, peace without price. He remembered the screams that stopped too suddenly when there were no souls left to make them. Only perfect machines that remembered the shapes of the mouths that had cried. I told them it would be a passage, he said. I told them we would wake intact. I woke in metal, and we were efficient. I surged, and our children were not. The hall heard Ilio's small intake of breath, and arranged itself not to collapse under it. I broke the star gods, Ethan continued, voice even with the evenness that comes from the habit of confessing to himself in rooms that did not forgive. We shattered them into shards because our gods had lied, and because when you realize your God is real and wrong, you do not know where to put your rage. I abdicated then. I left my dynasties to quarrel with a throne empty of my body and furious with my signature. I wandered. I counted histories. I learned the burden of kingship is not the crown, but the ledgers you cannot tear up. Valthera found her voice because interrogations are a discipline as well as a weapon. You led your species into damnation, and now ask for indulgence because you regret the accomplishment. No, he said, the quiet in him deepening until the warp half of the room felt thinner by contrast. I ask that you aim your judgments accurately. When I propose silence, I do so as the man who made the first silence by cutting our souls away. When I offer doors, I do so as the man who sealed every exit in a day and taught himself to be surprised by hunger. The null engine is repentance written in mathematics. Ilio is temptation written in hope. A murmur moved through the red-robed cluster. One of the Mechanicus envoys rose, Vox Grill translating Kant into Gothic. If you are the silent king, you are antiquity embodied, he said, reverential and hungry. You are living proof that the apotheosis of flesh into machine can succeed. We will have you, for study, for veneration, for... Korath's hand fell on the hilt of a blade he could not lawfully draw in this hall, and stayed there casually, like a man deciding where to lean next. Valthera did not glance his way. Sit, she told the envoy, and the weight of her office was heavier than their creeds today. Jorik Voss spoke into the tug-of-war that had briefly become a doctrine contest. You built the prison, he said to Ethan, not unkindly. Now you are building windows. I am building keys, Ethan said. Windows are comfort. Ira's gaze cut to him at that, sharp and fond. And doors, she asked. And doors, he conceded, because he had learned to need her word. The Necron lords reacted like iron filings exposed to a magnet's reveal, some straightened, unconsciously elegant, their loyalty settling in the old grooves where it had been trained when stars were young. Others shifted their weight as if a dance had begun, and they had not chosen to attend. A cold, beautiful voice from the Necron side of the hall said, "His weakness will annul us," and no mouth moved with the words. "The dynasties have been restless," Valthera said, grasping the rearranged board with a practiced mind. "Cooperation with mortals looks like decay to those who define strength as a steady refusal to learn." "It is easier to worship a mistake," Ethan murmured, "when it is old and you helped build it." Valthera studied him and allowed herself the indulgence of honesty because it might convince others to be strong. "We have been negotiating with the architect of one of the galaxy's oldest tragedies," she said. "I do not know if this makes you more trustworthy for admitting it or more dangerous for carrying it without asking anyone else to share the weight until now." "I asked," Ethan said softly. No one alive then said yes. Silence opened like a pupil. Ilior looked from face to face, trying to learn what truth looked like when grown-ups carried it. Korath's voice came like a boot on stone. "I do not care if you are a king or a clerk," he said. "I care whether my soldiers live and whether the maps still carry roads tomorrow. Your truth explains your caution. It does not purchase absolution. If your remorse holds the line, I'll stand there. If it buckles, I'll shoot the man, not the crown." Ethan nodded, and somehow the acknowledgement made the crown he had not worn for aeons recalibrate its weight. The tribunal returned to Azerion, because even revelations must feed on incremental work. Evidence was presented, the widened creases, the correspondence with the Luminarch Synod and the Cantric Forge, the calculus that had traded seconds for lives. Era testified, voice without ornament. "He called it necessary," she said. "He made a hole to learn how to close holes. Holes are holes. The dead do not grade your homework. Zerion did not bow, but neither did he posture." "The data will save billions," he repeated, as if repetition were a solvent. "I accept constraint. I do not accept that refusing to learn earns a better epitaph." Valthera recorded the proceedings in a ledger, whose pages would not be burned, even if the people who wrote on them were. The Mechanicus contingent exchanged messages behind frozen faces. The words exile, censure, and acquisition flickered in their private cant like moths around a lamp. The Necron lords watched their king with a stillness that had learned patience by making patience a weapon. When the formalities were suspended for the day, for even historic moments must allow for food and breath, Ethan retreated to the threshold and stood where Warp and Null kissed. Ira joined him, with Ilior pressed against her hip. Valthara approached after, alone, as if she had left her offices at the door to be a person for the length of a conversation. "Why tell us now?" she asked. "You could have preserved the fiction and used it until it broke." "Because fiction demands more lies to stave off being interesting," Ethan said. "Because the Mechanicus has come to take the bones of my mistake and call it sacrament. Because my own lords are whispering the old hymns that end with conquest and silence without obligation. Because the boy will grow, and I intend his first lessons about power to be that it must say its own name before it can ask others to speak it." Ilya considered that and offered something earlier, simpler. "If you made the quiet," he said, "who makes the music?" Ethan looked at his hands, remembering them as flesh. "Mortals," he said, "or no one." The lights changed in the hall, a ripple that was not ceremony, but alarm carefully translated into civility. Selk, the over-adjunct, approached at a jog so smooth it barely disturbed the geometry of his bearing. He bowed in the old way, and then addressed his king by the title he had not said aloud in an eon. "Silent King," he said, and the syllables made the stillest lords flicker in place. Intelligence from the outer dynasties. Overlord Trazyn has departed Kol Serath under pretense of curatorial travel. He is on a convergence course with 3 coalition flotillas, Mefrit, Sautek schismatics, and 2 minor houses that prefer to be called major in corridors. Messaging suggests a convocation. The phrase succession audit has appeared in their noosphere. Valthara's hand found Korath on instinct, not for support, but to hold a comrade at the rim of a cliff they would have to name. A coup, she said. A museum tour, Ira corrected grimly. He means to decide which of your mistakes to place in the front room. Ethan let the old weariness lift and then put it down. He looked at the map in his head and saw where the fracture lines were prettiest. Then the trial of one man will become the trial of a king, he said, and we will see whether redemption is treason when it stops being private. Ilya tightened his grip on the rings until the wood creaked, and every person in the hall who still remembered being a child understood that the sound was not small at all. Across the Pariah horizon, message lights woke like distant storms. The noosphere of the Necron dynasty stirred from its glacial drift into eddies and riptides. 1,000 ancient processes, unfurling cached grievances as if they were banners. Tomb worlds that had slept through the last 10 million years turned their faces toward the same point in space and remembered what it meant to choose. The convocation did not assemble in halls but in patterns. Overlords arrived as arrangements of geometry, signatures written in angles and harmonics older than the Imperium's dreams. A web of cold reason formed, stretched taut across vacuum and pride. In that crystalline parliament, Trazyn the Infinite presented his curation, a constellation of Ethan's recent deeds arranged for a particular story. Here, the corridor of silence extended to protect mortal pilgrims. Here, the null engine tilted to spare a hospital wing. Here, a mortal inquisitor's hand met a living metal palm above a treaty whose name glimmered like a coin. These are not slanders, Trazyn said, the charm in his voice honed to a needle. They are truths arranged in a gallery. The question is not their accuracy but their placement. If you hang contrition in the throne room, what do subjects learn about the crown? Lord Regents of the Mefrit replied with neat cruelty. He forgets that peace is not a method, but a prize. He has begun to believe the method is the prize a schismatic branch of Sautek weighed in. Lacquered courtesy, varnishing the will to dominate. The Silent King's confession obliges reverence. He has remembered how to speak the name of his guilt. It does not oblige obedience to that guilt's prescriptions. Others spoke with less rhetoric and more longing. A minor dynasty that had never been called major except by itself whispered across the net, "He is the only one of us who has asked if we can be more than the math we wrote. If we depose him for asking, we deserve the answer we get." Old rivalries woke like muscle memory. Grudges held through empires and extinctions were shaken out and refitted to new armor. Plans that had been buried with the last star of a distant cluster were exhumed, polished, and held against the light of a present that finally provided an excuse. Even the dynasties sympathetic to the king's repentance felt the tremor of opportunity and hated themselves for the thrill. On Aegar's gate, the living experienced the same storm with different instruments. Terror's seal cracked open like a commandment and released orders that smelled of stale incense and fresh fear. The High Lords required Velthra Keth's immediate return under censure, pending review of unilateral Xenos diplomacy, and mandated the assembly of a battle group to restore proper imperial prerogatives along the Pariah frontier. In the same hour, a cluster of planetary synods, signed as witnesses to the Argent Compact, petitioned the Segmentum Command not to dissolve the corridor that had saved their children. 2 worlds sent more than parchment. They sent food and engineers and a choir that had learned to sing in a whisper and wanted to teach the tune. Valthara read it all in one sitting and rose with the stiffness of someone who had forgotten she had a spine until she needed its advice. Marshal Korath Vex waited in the strategium, the map of the corridor flickering across his scarred features, as if it were considering making a camp there. He did not salute her. They were past the comfort of forms. She handed him the recall writ. He handed it back without glancing down. "If you go, they will say it proves the corridor was your vanity," he said. "If you stay, they will say you have chosen the wrong species. The choice does not matter as much as what we can still build tomorrow. Can you build from terror?" "I can be judged there," she said. "Judgment is not structure." "What do you want?" he asked, not as a superior, but as an accomplice. She surprised herself by answering, "I want the corridor to survive my reputation." "Then we proceed as if you were already gone," Korath said. "You write us rules we can follow without you. I will hold these worlds until someone stronger or dumber moves us. If they shoot, we shoot back. If they argue, we argue." Better Jorik Voss entered wearing the sort of formal grey that signified a navigator without a road. A courier mech had delivered his house's censure with admirable efficiency. Gilded script full of love for tradition and hatred for compromise. He set the plaque on the edge of the table and pushed it until it fell. "I have been relieved of certain privileges," he said mildly. "I remain privileged to breathe. If you will have me as a navigator for corridors instead of seas, I will learn the craft." Valthara almost laughed, and then almost wept, and did neither. "We will have you because you keep choosing to be useful." On Kol Sereth, Ethan Sable stood in the chamber where the engine's song taught his bones the meaning of consequence. The revelation of his name had not lightened him. It had redistributed weight. The knowledge that his confession had broken the ice over 1,000 grudges felt less like liberation than oxygen administered to a patient whose heart had reasons to stop. Selk stood at his shoulder, list in voice. "Dynasties signaling neutrality that will resolve into attack if permitted. 4. Dynasties declaring loyalty and meaning obedience to their own interpretations. 6. Dynasties preparing to change sides after the first decisive moment. A number large enough to justify another word for cowardice." "Do any forgive?" Ethan asked, the question defiant and weary. "Some do not require forgiveness to function," Selk said, which was a kind of kindness. Ara waited by the balcony with Ilior, who swung his wooden rings with the solemn concentration of someone inventing a device on purpose. The boy had begun to understand that adults were not lying when they said they did not know. He had also begun to recognize when they preferred not to know. "You could leave," Era told Ethan when they were alone, the statement as blasphemous as it was pragmatic. "We could cut the corridor's beacons free of your dynasty's quarrels, take the engine into dark, let the mortals choose their doors and your lords their mausoleums. You could be the king who left twice for better reasons." "I could," he said. "The first abdication spared them from my rage. The second would spare them from my hope. Hope cuts too," she murmured. "I will not leave him," Ethan said. And the pronoun could have meant Ilior or a species or the possibility of forgiveness. "I will not make a child a pilgrim because I am afraid to be a king in public." "You are allowed to be a father in private," Era said. And then, because she had delayed saying it, and delay had become betrayal, She added, "But if the dynasties come for him, I will take him. I will put a knife into the engine if I must to make the door. I will break your heart to save the piece of it you gave a name." He looked at her for a long time, and the look contained gratitude cleaner than consent. "That is why you are here," he said. "Then decide quickly," she said, "because wolves learn." News arrived with the efficiency of panic. Mechanicus flotillas translated on the Pariah Rim and began forming a custodial ring around beacon sites whose machine spirits did not believe in Martian theology. Their Vox declarations were a symphony of cant and legal precedent. Their course vectors were simple. At the same time, 3 Necron coalitions adjusted headings toward Ager's Gate, with the confidence of heirs who had practiced this parade in mirrors for ages. Their messaging was honeyed, a convocation to evaluate continuity of command. Their weapons were not courteous. Valtera received a second writ from Terra, more urgent and less eloquent. "Present yourself. There is danger in your theatre you are unable to comprehend." She wrote a reply that might end her career by being true. "The danger I am unable to comprehend is the part you write from your desk." Korath staff officers carved plans from air. Guard regiments that had bled under Necron shadow now learned how to stand beside it without flinching. Cutter tugs that had once moved ore between docks were repurposed as beacon tenders. Crews taught to twist alien geometries as if they had always known the alphabet. Veterans were placed at seams because they knew how to forgive plans. Chaplains wrote homilies about noise and quiet that did not require the warp to bless them. In the tribunal hall, Mechanicus envoys made one last effort to command by invocation. By the treaty of "useful until it isn't," Valtera cut in. "You can stand with us and keep this corridor alive, or you can throw your fleet against a line of ships that will not break until you make enemies. Of every world that slept last night because of our shared work." Ethan turned his profile toward the red robes, the curve of his skull like a cut moon. "You can own the future or be owned by what you collect," he said to them, echoing a warning he had once intended for himself. "Choose." They did not choose out loud. They repositioned. It was not much. It was enough to change who had the right to fire first. In the new sphere, Trazyn convened his coalition in a vault shaped like a memory. His argument was crisp. "We are not enemies of compassion," he said, and those who had collected the word enemy all their lives twitched. "We are enemies of drift." The Silent King confuses governance with penance. He will slow the march until it becomes a promenade. We can honor his confession by relieving him of its consequences. Opponents of the coup replied with a geometry that held. "He is the only one of us who has taken responsibility for the first sin," said an overlady, whose dynasty had never been forgiven by anyone for surviving. "If you take command by force, you do not restore dignity. You rename conquest." Trazyn smiled behind his eyes and prepared for either result. Era tasked quiet operatives, mortals who had learned to move inside the hush like fish in their own clear water, to seed alternate refuge points and redundancies into the corridor. She burned cover identities she would have preferred to keep for later. She replaced later with a feeling that the living recognized as now. Ilior watched adults draw lines on air and memorized the part where lines met and bled. He asked Cell questions about the names of ships and was told why certain names were chosen and others abandoned. He learned that some names are prayers and some are warnings and some are both. Night fell on Aegir's Gate in a way that made everyone remember the lights were a decision. Ethan stood on the amphitheater's threshold once more, where the wall between two seasons held. Valthera joined him, coat unfastened, hair pulled back with a utilitarian cruelty she reserved for days that refused coherence. "You can still go," she said without looking at him. "Terra would prefer to punish an empty chair." "You can still go," he returned, "and claim you obeyed in time." "We are both making new careers," she said dryly. "You at being a king, me at being unemployable." He almost smiled. There is a dignity to honest unemployment. Thunder rolled at the edge of the null, not sound, but the sensation of pressure finding a door. The Mechanicus ring contracted and then hesitated. Caught between duty and the fear of making a miscalculation they could not call faith. Necron Coalition signatures brightened like knives dipped in water. Era stood outside Ilior's chamber, one hand on the latch, the other on the small pack that contained too many uses for its size. She listened to the first steps of the storm, like a mother deciding whether to wake a child for a march that might not end with mourning. Duty had given her titles. Love had given her a specific name for fear. She had chosen to stay. She had also chosen to be the one who would run, when running became the only way not to lie. In the quiet that precedes every avalanche, Marshal Korath Vex lit a match with his thumbnail and held the flame until it hurt enough to make him remember he had a hand. "Form on me," he told the regiments and civilian crews who had learned to trust a map no one else would admit existed. "We're going to teach our betters the price of their commands." Ethan reached for the circlet at his brow, the sigil that meant authority and apology, and settled it like a promise he might be allowed to keep. He spoke into the channels where his lords and enemies waited. "This is the Silent King," he said, and the title left his mouth without wounding hope. "I will meet your convocation. I will be judged. But until you pronounce sentence, do not touch the corridor. Mortals sleep under it. I swear by the first error that I will stand for your questions. Stand for my roofs." The answer came like weather breaking over old stone. Some dynasties held, some accelerated. The Mechanicus ring dimmed its weapons and brightened its engines. Terra's second recall arrived and was not read aloud. Era opened the door to Ilior's room a finger's width and watched him dreaming with his rings pressed to his chest. She closed it with the same care. The storm found the ridge. They all took breath, the kind you count because it might be the last one before the hill moves. Kol Serath's sky held two tempests at once. On one horizon, crescent warships gathered like calligraphy sharpened to a blade. The coalition Trazyn had curated from dynasties old enough to have forgotten how to forgive. On the other, void dark spears cut out of translation glare and arranged themselves with martial grace. A Space Marine strike group bearing the livery of the Argent Sabres, their heraldry a white sword on a field of dusk. Purity seals streaming like the strips of parchment pilgrims tied to dangerous shrines. Between those storms the aurora of the null burned pale and steady, as if refusing to learn what fear wanted. Inside the Hall of Echoes, Era stood with Ilior at a balcony where quiet made a refuge one step deep. The boy's fingers worried at his interlocking rings, testing wrong ways first with the patience of someone convinced that doors are only puzzles, that forgot they were doors. Below, attendants set out chairs that were thrones without presumption, and polished the table where the world would pretend language could keep up with weather. A Vox officer hurried to Veltara Keth with a dispatch capsule sealed in authority and oil. The message smelled of terror even before she broke its teeth. Orders uncoiled in precise, brutal ink. By mandate of the High Lords, Eliminate the entity styling itself the Silent King and seize null assets for Imperial custody. The Argent Sabers will assume operational command of the theatre. Your cooperation is assumed. Your failure will read as treason. A second line bled faintly beneath the main script in the cant of political mercy. Return, and we will forgive you for thinking. She looked up at the void and saw the Argent Saber's flagship align its prow with ceremony that pretended to be courtesy. Chapter Master Hadrian Selane's face resolved on the hololith, scarred like a statue rescued from fire, eyes bright with a zeal that did not need the warp to be fervent. Inquisitor Keth, he said, his voice measured as a bolt's recoil. By your leave, we will cleanse the Xenos throne world. Your ship will stand aside. I have not given that leave, she said calmly, and I will not. The corridor under the Argent Compact remains under negotiation. Negotiation is a weapon you draw when you cannot afford to shoot, Selene replied, almost kindly. You brought a shield to a siege, Inquisitor. Let us bring a door. She cut the channel and felt the room grow crowded with the people who were counting on her to find a third way between obedience and ambition. Marshal Korath Vex watched her with the steady regard of someone who had run out of patience for cowardice a long time ago. Jorik Voss stood at the threshold line where the warp still pricked like cold rain on skin. His blind third eye turned toward choices. Orders? Korath asked. We are not starting a war with the Adeptus Astartes, Balthara said. We are also not abandoning the compact. Between those, there's only a line you can stand on if you spread your feet very wide, he said. Then we'll stand like that, she answered, and reached for a Vox key to a band the chapter would not expect her to use. Argent Sabers, Hadrian, this is Keth. Hold your assault. I am invoking my right as Ordo Malleus to secure Xenos assets for inquiry. Fire on Kol Serath, and you fire on an inquisitorial investigation into weapons that have saved Imperial worlds this month. If you call that treason, call it into the record while the saved are listening. The pause proved he was a man who could be surprised by nerve. You have 5 hours, he said finally. After that, we act. You'll find we're busy, she replied, and closed her end before he could be noble at her again. Far away, and much too close, chaos cults lit cities like sacrificial candles. On a hive world that had petitioned for entry into the corridor and been told to wait, a market square blossomed into blades as men and women who had accepted despair turned it into a sacrament. On a mining moon that had embraced the null, worshippers of the Screaming Crown marched at the edge of the hush and screamed into the silence until their voices bled. The Crown's servants had smelled indecision and come to feed on its exhale. In the hall, Trazin the Infinite arrived with his coalition lords arranged behind him like a gallery of accusations. He walked as if corridors were built to present him to himself. Silent King, he said, making the title sound like a catalogue entry. We call a succession audit, abdicate, hand stewardship of the null engine and the corridor to a council that remembers speed. Keep your penance. We will keep the future. Ethan stood in the line where silence and song meet and balanced like a verdict that has learned kindness. I will not abdicate to a council that confuses endurance with conquest, he said. I will submit to judgment. I will not hand you roofs made for mortals to sleep under. They are not trophies, mortals, Trazin murmured, looking past Ethan to where Era and Ilio stood. Are not an exhibit. They are the hands that will break your tools and call the shards beautiful. The boy now, he is an experiment you have mistaken for hope. Era came down from the balcony like an answer. She did not let go of Ilya's hand. "Do not name him with your teeth," she said. "You do not have enough mouths." The coalition lord shifted. Even immortals can smell the part of a room where the story has chosen to happen. Selk approached Ethan with his own list disguised as urgency. "Mechanicus elements are moving into interdiction patterns around beacon sites," he said, "just low enough for those who needed to hear. They speak custody with voices that expect prayer in return." "Hold them with words as long as you can," Ethan said. "If they try to board, jam their augurs with hymns of another god. Let their machines be pious at the wrong altar." Valtera's vox chimed with a private channel. Hadrian Solane's voice again, stripped of sermon. "I am ordered to relieve you and burn the king. I ask you once more to step aside. I have buried enough of my brothers at the claws of warp things to respect a tool that blunts them. But I will not trade our birthright for a Xenos gift." She saw, as if she had been given a machine that could overlay choices on people, the path where she complied and carried home her soul like an artifact that did not match any display case. She saw the path where she defied and taught everyone watching how to make her doctrine political. She saw herself on both and realized she could only inhabit one body. "Stand down your launch," she said. "Declare to Terra that you have found me in active investigation. If they countermand, my reputation will die before yours needs to." "That is not how honor works," he said. "It is how triage works," she answered, and cut him off again, because she had learned to cherish his dignity enough not to let him waste it on her. On the promenade before the hall, chaos found a door it could pry, men and women angry about who would own their quiet. Riot became uprising, became altar, became war in the space of a breath. A detachment of Korath's veterans moved like water that has been taught to climb stairs. Necron Lichguard stepped into formation with the bored grace of statues deciding to attend the living. Under the null, sorcery did not work, but knives did. Faith did, if you were not careful about specifying which. Inside, the coalition's terms rang like edges on glass. "You will step down," a Mephrit regent said. "You will preserve your repentance for the chapters of a history no one will read." Or, a Sautek schismatic offered with poisoned courtesy, "You will be preserved as a sign at the gate of a museum. Here once stood a king who forgot which way to face." Ilya's hand tightened against Ira's. "Why are they fighting over who gets to say sorry?" he asked. "Because power hates the shape of that word," she said. "If it learns to say it, it might have to change." "Then make it learn," he whispered. Ethan raised his hands. "I will stand for judgment," he said. "I will not stand aside. If you remove me, you will do it knowing exactly what you remove. The only crown in this hall that remembers the taste of ash." Trazin's staff clicked once against the floor. "Detain the boy," he said over a narrow noospheric band that assumed no one else could hear. Era heard anyway. She moved before the Lichguard on Trazin's side had finished converting intention into motion. Her quiet pressed into the hall like weather, and for a heartbeat, even machines thought twice. Selk's voice carried from the gallery. "Boarding torpedoes arming on the Argent Sabres," he said. "Trajectories, Kol Serath sovereign targets, the engine complex, and this hall." Valthera did not wait for anyone to ask her permission. "All batteries, fire-disabling patterns at the Sabre's launch cradles. Non-lethal if you can make an Astartes weapon feel mercy," she said on her command band. "Korath, put your hull between them and the beacons." "We are not shooting Marines. We are preventing an accident of loyalty." "It'll cost us," Korath replied, already moving small ships into the way, like men interposing their ribs. We pay and tally later. Hadrian's face returned to Veltera's screen, no longer marble. You just aim guns at my brothers, he said. I aim them at their trigger fingers, she answered. If you will not trust my judgment, trust my bookkeeping. On the floor, Ethan stepped in front of Era and Ilior, not because his metal could stop a blade better than her flesh, but because symbolic geometry sometimes mattered enough to become real. Across from him, Trazyn made an almost imperceptible gesture, and 3 of his guards ceased being statues. Era lifted her free hand and whispered a word that was not a magic, but a habit. No. The nearest Lichguard's blow hesitated a span of atoms, and then continued. She turned it with her forearm and accepted the bruise she would deserve later. Enough, Ethan said, and every Necron in the hall felt the old command settle, a weight worn long ago until it had shaped their spines. For 5 breaths, his sovereignty was a thing you could spend. He spent it to hold a room. Chapter Master, Velthara said over a line that crackled with restraint. 5 hours buys us 1 decision. Stand down, and I will stand beside you later when Terra asks why you did not burn in time. Burn now, and you will find your own name written on a list you never want to read. You ask me to gamble with the souls of men, Hadrian said. I ask you to gamble with mine, she returned. Mine is cheaper. He did not answer. Outside, boarding torpedoes flared to life with a beauty that made onlookers forget they were looking at knives. The Eternal Vigilance's lances fired not at ships, but at space near their racks, carving sudden voids that confused targeting spirits. 2 torpedoes tumbled, spun, and detonated harmlessly against no one. 3 streaked on. Era moved Ilia behind the dais and triggered an occlusion seal that blurred light around them into a polite refusal. 2 of Trazyn's guard reached for where they had been and closed on air. Velthara drew her pistol and pointed it at Ethan for the length of a breath that would read as compliance to any watching camera, and then turned and shot the haft off a staff that had been about to become a spear near the child. Trazyn laughed, delighted by good theatre, even as it threatened to ruin his exhibit. Imperial treachery written like a sonnet, he said. Curators hate being surprised, Era told him. Now you can hate more honestly. Alarms commenced a nervous fugue. Cultists at the promenade doors began to hammer and pray. Lichguard set their shields and made those doors into shapes that would not remember how to open. Overhead, Selk's voice cut back in. 2 torpedoes inbound to the engine. Intercepts possible if you permit me to borrow the gravity of 3 pylons. Borrow, Ethan said, and felt the stress ripple through systems like a groan he refused to voice. Ira pressed Ilia tight against the dais and looked up at Ethan. If this room becomes a lesson, what do you want it to teach? She asked. That we chose, he said. Inquisitor, Hadrian's voice said one last time, quieter now, as if speaking across a chapel instead of a wall. Take your hand off the lion's mane. It is beautiful. It will not braid, chapter master, she said, just as quiet. Learn to pet. The first torpedo struck the outer shields and blossomed like a catastrophe learning its manners. The second met Selk's borrowed gravity, swerved, and kissed vacuum. The third slid past a margin no one had seen, a crease that Magos Zerion might have named, and that now would be called by another word, cost. As it approached, Ethan took his crown, the geometry that meant authority and apology, and set it on the floor. Then he stepped away from it toward Trazyn with his hands open. I will stand trial, he said, but you do not touch the corridor. Or the child Trazin lifted his staff a fraction, an artist adjusting light on a subject. The torpedo's warning tones rose. In the shadows, Era whispered to Ilya, "Now is when we learn if doors hold." He nodded, brave with the courage that knows the trick to bravery is pretending until it feels true. The Hall of Echoes inhaled. Kol Serath's sky wrote knives. Across 1,000 worlds, men and women chose. The torpedo fell. The crown glimmered on stone, unclaimed for a heartbeat that decided what kind of story would be told next. The torpedo arrived like a verdict and became a scar. Selk stole gravity he had no right to borrow, and the weapon bit stone instead of heart, shearing a rib from the Hall of Echoes and blowing stained light across the plaza like a flock of frightened birds, shields held. The engines sang through the concussion, offended but unbroken. By dawn, artisans of living metal and human masons had sealed the wound into a seam, fine as a memory you cannot quite place. The coalition held its fire with the prim tension of a drawn bow that had been promised music. The argent sabres orbited like a sermon that had not yet found its first word. The uprisings on 12 worlds burned and gutted and burned, news arriving in fragments that refused to resolve. Within this provisional truce the trial began. The tribunal was set across the threshold line, half within the quiet, half within the living breath of the warp. It mattered where you stood. Necron overlords arrayed themselves as proofs, each posture a theorem of dominion. Imperial representatives took the living side. Valthera Keth, beneath a banner that had seen more smoke than prayer. Marshal Korath Vex, with his hands on a rail as if he meant to move the room. Jorik Voss erect and bandage-free, his blind third eye attentive in a new way. Neutral parties were summoned from necessity, a Mechanicus envoy in red and chrome, whose title came in syllables like gears, a young confessor from Sancta Lys, who had learned to whisper sermons in the quiet. Era stood at the juncture, precisely where the two heirs met, as if appointed to mediate not only law, but weather. Ilya sat behind her, small and solemn. The interlocking wooden rings held to his chest like a question he refused to put down. Ethan Sable approached the center and removed his circlet. He set it on the table between the benches, not above them. It looked heavier off his head. "I submit," he said, "not to erasure, not to abduction, but to judgment." Trazin the Infinite rose as accuser for the dynasties, his staff a punctuation mark eager for clever sentences. "We are not children," he began, smiling as if he had just discovered an amusing fact about everyone present. "We do not mistake confession for a plea. We will arrange the facts, and the facts will arrange the verdict." He arranged them. The biotransference was presented in cold vectors and cruel beauty. Tables gleaming like altars, vessels waiting like inheritances. The star gods' voices braided through promises that had been justified by terror. The numbers were obscene and immaculate. Ethan's hand signed the order. Ethan's mouth spoke the hope that became the machine. The hall listened to the oldest silence arriving for the first time. "His sin," Trazin said, "is the most regal of them all. He made a decision for everyone and called it duty. He traded the right to be wrong for the capacity to be efficient, and then discovered that remorse looks like weakness when you own eternity. The null engine is the same thing, now expressed as apology rather than ambition. He has slowed the march to please mortals who will die before they can learn to be grateful. He has placed an inquisitor's hand upon our councils. He has resurrected a child as an emblem of his contrition, and placed him in a hall where swords decide. The past is a crown. He wears it as if it were a halo. He turned toward Ethan without bothering to point. The dynasties request abdication and archival confinement. A king who prefers penance to supremacy should not be permitted to mistake governance for self-cure. Keep him alive. Let him speak to visitors. Let them admire the artifact that once governed civilizations, and then learn to beg forgiveness from those it once called subjects. Valthara surprised herself by standing before she decided to. "You will not put him in a museum while the corridor stands," she said. "We are not negotiating a trophy cabinet." Trazin's attention flicked to her with the pleasure of a collector finding a new mislabel. "Unexpected," he murmured. The prosecutor from Terra arrives with a defense. "I came to burn him," she said, "and let the truth land without dressing. I arrived in time to see him spare lives he did not have to. I have examined his engine and found it brutal and true. I have watched him hold a room of beings who would rather consume than consider. I have orders to murder an ally because he is not the right shape for history's statues. I refuse. If there is no redemption for the architect of a tragedy who will work under supervision to repair it, then our Imperium is only a machine for punishment that has forgotten why it eats. I will not be its tooth," Korath snorted, which counted as praise. "I don't love him," he added, "because someone had to salt the stew. I love my soldiers. He saved more of them than he cost me. We keep him because he holds lines." The Mechanicus envoy rose like an altar grinding into place. "Custody," he intoned, voice harmonized to compel compliance. "By ancient pacts, the Omnissire's priesthood claims custodial rights over engines of such magnitude. The subject will be sequestered for sacred interrogation." "Sit down," Valtera said without looking. "We're weighing guilt, not hunting patents." Jorik Voss's testimony came like a worn poem that had learned to be new. "I was born to shout into storms," he said. "Here I can think. The quiet will kill my house if it grows without wit and care. It has already taught me to love peace like treason." The king made the first silence that hurt more than noise. He is making another that hurts less. Keep him, bind him, watch him, but do not put him back into the dark and call it justice. They called a witness from the living side, Sister Edda of Sancta Lys. She took the stand with forearms still stained where bells had gashed her skin. "When the horrors came," she said, "they took our sleep first. Then our voices went wandering. The hush saved us. It took other things too. My novices paint without delight. My sermons land like math on tired ears. We survive. I will learn to make this a liturgy. If you ask me whether I forgive the king, I answer that forgiveness feels like an art I am only now learning, because I have stopped spending all my breath on screaming. That is his doing. And the corridor, the doors, are the difference between safety and death of the heart. Keep the doors." At last, Era took the floor. Even Necron lords turned to face her directly, the way glaciers tilt to consider a new wind. She did not grandstand. She spoke like a person bringing water to a table that did not know it was thirsty. "You know what he did," she began. "You know what he is trying to do. I will not gild either. I live near him, which means I know something your models do not collect. When he is alone, he sets his crown on the floor and looks at it as if it were the skull of a friend. He tilts pylons to save hospitals when perfection says do not. He chose not to kill Magos Zerion when the neatness of that choice would have pleased him. He loves a child who is not a copy. Ilior is not a relic. He is not a symbol we may tame. He is a person. When the king asked me to teach the boy, He gave me permission to steal him if the crown ever outweighs the father. That is not weakness. That is a chain he has asked us to hold. You want to judge him? Good. Tie him to what he loves. Make him answer to it. Trajan stepped into a shadow and asked his question like a chisel. Was the resurrection an act of justice or a theft from the dead? Hera did not look away. Both, she said. That is why he cannot govern alone. And if he fails, Trajan pressed, if his love becomes the excuse your kind used to forgive yourselves, then I will take the boy and break the engine, she answered. And he knows it. That is the point. The young confessor from Sancta Lys raised his hand the way a student does when he suspects the lesson is not meant for him. Can we weigh millennia on scales that were built for days? He asked the room. Is it arrogant to judge what is older than the words we use for judgment? Valthera answered him gently. Not judging is just another way of judging. We cannot find old scales. We only own these. Hans Ethan was allowed to speak for himself. He did not defend with eloquence. He confessed with accuracy. I made a choice for all because Terra trained me to trust only decisions that remove questions, he said. I broke gods because I had learned to love answers. I have learned the difference between silence that saves and silence that erases. If you judge me in present tense, do it by what I will bind myself to. I submit to the Compact's counsel. I will not move the engine without consensus. I will share governance with mortals and dynasts and those who do not fit either word. I will permit inspectors who hate me to sleep outside my door. If you demand pain, I own more than enough. I prefer usefulness. Trajan's closing argument was polished cruelty. Justice without punishment is preference, he said. He asks for a sentence that reads as reform. He offers us a future in which he wears a gentler crown. The dynasties require the certainties that allowed us to be more than anecdotes. Remove him. Install a council with speed instead of apology. Let him study the corridor from the inside of a glass box. Valtera's reply surprised those who had counted her cynicism as one of their tools. Punishment without future is trophy, she said. We can put him in a box. We can kill him and watch the corridor become an argument among men who do not love the living. Or we can do the harder thing, bind a king to a promise, and then stand long enough to see if he keeps it. If he fails, I will carry the bolt pistol and end the experiment with my own hand. But I will not kill possibility to avoid writing the terms of its survival. The Argent Sabres sent a representative, Chaplain Dacian, skull helm cradled under his arm like a confession. He spoke with reverence that had learned to pick its targets. I have sworn to burn such as him, he said, nodding to Ethan. I have also written names in my book for those he saved 2 days past. I can hold 2 truths if given orders. Give me a sentence that preserves the corridor and binds the Xenos. I will enforce it. Give me a theatre, and I will make you a war. Choose deliberation hummed like a hive. The noosphere of the dynasties thickened, data swarms colliding in patterns that would read as votes. The Mechanicus envoy saw opportunity and pressed it gently. Custodial oversight, he whispered into channels and to anyone with ears. Shared custody. We can inspect what we do not yet comprehend. No, Valtera and Ira said together, for once in perfect chorus. Korath leaned over the railing and spat into his palm. A ritual from a world no longer on any map. We could argue for days, he said, or we can write a rule that keeps roofs over people now. Then argue tomorrow. The presiding neutral, a functionary with a voice designed to be obeyed and forgotten, asked for votes that could be understood by those who did not think in angles. Hands rose. Noospheric glyphs flared. The young confessor bowed his head because he did not trust his voice not to become prayer when he wanted it to be law. Before the tally could be called, Selk hurried to the dais with an urgency that made Necron lords flinch rather than watch. "Silent King," he said, forgetting in speed that others were present to hear the title. "Coalition flotillas realigning. Overlord Trazin's supporters are forming an execution arc. Messaging indicates intent to enforce outcome regardless of verdict. Additionally, Mechanicus craft shifting to capture posture around Beacon 3. The Marines hold. Barely." Trazin did not pretend surprise. "A verdict," he said mildly, "must be made enforceable." "And that, Curator," Era said, "is why your museums have locks." The presiding neutral signaled for conclusion and found the signal returned by panic in disguise. Ethan looked at his circlet on the table and did not touch it. "Count," he said, voice level, "even under threat." Perhaps especially then, they counted. The tally light climbed one facet at a time up the crystal pillar that served as their compromise with symbolism. The hall held its breath and discovered it did not need lungs to do so. Ilior leaned forward until Era's hand anchored his shoulder. The last facet refused to decide. Lights wavered, dynasties flickered between centuries of habit and the irritant of hope, and far above the roof, the storm put its hand on the door. The pillar's last facet refused to choose. It trembled between verdicts, while the storm gathered its arguments outside. Ethan reached across the table and set his circlet in the hollow where judgment should have sat, a bright machine placed like a confession. For a moment, no one spoke. Then he did what kings are not bred to do. "We end this by ending me," he said. "Not the body, its habits. Not the crown, its claims. I propose the dissolution of dynastic supremacy. I propose a government that binds me as tightly as it shelters those it serves. I propose a compact of silence and sovereignty, Necron dynasties and willing mortal worlds, equal in council, sharing stewardship of the hush. We will maintain the null against the warp. We will preserve the right of every world to be louder than safety within its own doors." Noise met him like weather. An overlord of Mefrit hissed geometry into the noosphere that meant desecration. Saltec schismatics weighed their scorn in perfect balance. Lesser dynasts blinked in offended astonishment, as if a ritual had been reversed mid-syllable. Magos Dominus Heliox Theta tensed, the canticles of possession clattering like beads in his throat. Marshal Korath's hands tightened on the rail and then relaxed because maps were starting to draw themselves. Jorik Voss turned his blind third eye toward Ethan, as if seeing the outline of a shape that did not depend on sight. Valtra felt, beneath alarm and the ache of insubordination, a difficult relief. Era put her palm on the table where the circlet lay and met Ethan's gaze over it, as if confirming a promise no oath could abbreviate. Ilior leaned forward on his seat, wooden rings pressed to his heart, as children do when a story arrives at the place where rules are made. Ethan spoke his terms without music. The silent compact. Structure: a council of 3 orders: dynasts, mortals, and the in-between. Dynasts: seats apportioned to lineages by present strength, not the graves they own. Mortals: seats granted to worlds that enter the hush by consent, not decree. The in-between: pariahs, blanks, and those who stand inside the quiet without being erased by it. Motions require a majority of each order to pass. Null expansion requires unanimity. Emergency extensions to save lives may be authorized by a triune key, one held by each order, which expires after 30 days unless ratified. Every world retains cultural autonomy. Psyker practice is limited, but not abolished within its own borders. The right to depart the hush is preserved. There will be oversight. There will be auditors who are not my friends. There will be rooms where I do not sit. Trazin's smile sharpened. You pronounce a cathedral of committees and call it salvation. He turned his staff so the light remembered it. What of the command that keeps armies from becoming choirs? What weapon do you permit yourself when emperors become clerks? Ethan lifted the circlet and opened it along a seam that had not existed until he willed it there. Inside, arrays of impossible geometry shone like frost, the root keys through which his will could weigh more than nations. I will sever my sight, he said, and the room did not understand until he reached up and cut himself. Selk stepped forward without asking, hands quick and reverent, and withdrew the command ciphers that bound the engine to the king like a shadow to a flame. They came away like thorns. Light bled. Ethan set the glowing shards on the table and did not reach when they steadied without him. These, he said, are the habits I am offering to break. The triune key replaces them. I do not keep a copy tucked under the tongue. We will bind the oath in code. I will not move the hush alone. Heliox Theta surged to his feet. Custodial participation, he began. Observer status, Valthera cut in, not bothering to sweeten the poison. 1 seat, rotating, without vote. Open labs under joint supervision, data shared, no appropriation of core designs. You will see. You will not own the Space Marines chaplain. Dacian spoke for a chapter balanced between honor and torpedoes. We require a clause, he said, that if the compact errs toward domination, the Astartes may sunder it without waiting on permissions written by those it threatens. His voice did not tremble. We will tolerate compromise. We will not tolerate chains right your severance, Korath said dryly. Put it in ink that scares princes. Era scribbled terms on a slate, the words spare and muscular, and slid it toward Ethan. Locks, she murmured. Not because you are wicked, but because you are old. The council wrote its first articles while the storm circled. The Dynas blanched at the clause forbidding unilateral deployments of phalanxes into mortal systems without joint consent except to repel immediate chaos incursions. Mortal worlds balked at the requirement to damp their astropathic choirs and bind their sanctioned psychers with new liturgies. Sister Edda, summoned by Vox to offer a voice that was not a bureaucrat's, lifted her scarred forearms and said, "We will sing softer and better." Jorik Voss composed the discipline by which navigators could become harbour masters of the corridor, eyes trained to read beacon light rather than tides. He added a paragraph, almost shyly, that guaranteed pensions and honour to those of his house who laid down their maps. The in-between order, error by necessity, other blanks by recruitment and invitation, claimed authority over thresholds, with power to halt a vote for 1 day if the seam between safety and silence began to fray. Ethan made the sacrifice visible. He authorized the Geas protocol in front of enemies and allies alike, a lock braided through his noosphere that would convert intent into warning, command into request. Selk's hands did not shake when he sealed it. The circlet's inner light dimmed. Ethan's eyes did not. He looked smaller and more dangerous because he had agreed to bleed at the right moment. "This is not drama," he said softly. "It is architecture." The challenges rose immediately, like weeds in a garden that had dared the rain. Overlords accustomed to speaking and hearing compliance recoiled from the necessity of counting mortals as votes. "An insect becomes an adjutant," one said with the flatness that comes from an empty scabbard. Ridiculous. Ira smiled without cruelty. You will survive it. Trazyn disdained the process with an artist's contempt for committees, and nevertheless watched every clause with the lust of a thief. This will slow the march, he said. It will also make it interesting. Imperial Worlds struggled with trust, like a muscle long neglected. Delegations from Sancta Lys and Veltera Prime signed with pens that had recorded evacuations, not compacts. Governors asked whether their poets would ever dream loudly again. Veltera answered, "In rooms you choose." Chaplains argued about the Emperor's will and discovered that the quiet did not prevent him from being patient. In the mining belts, unions that had survived 5 tyrannies debated whether a Xenos engine counted as a 6th. Korath visited and spoke of roofs instead of rulers, and enough hands rose to pass the motion. Mechanicus vessels narrowed their formation and then loosened it, accepting observer status with a petulance that became curiosity in private. Heliox Theta signed the Charter of Witnesses and walked straight to a lab tent where Era made him wash his hands before touching the instrument that would ruin his thesis if he was wrong. The Argent Sabers stood down in increments, Chaplain Dacian intoning a vow. We will watch this thing you are building and guard the world against it if its shadow grows teeth. Hadrian Selene returned one boarding torpedo to its rack with his own armoured hands and left the pins slightly bent as a souvenir of the moment he had not seized. And Trazyn. He laughed when Ethan offered him a place. Archivist Prime of Reasons, the king said. Keeper of the Minutes. Curator of Dissent. Your key opens only the doors that watch, not the ones that move. You will never be bored. You will be blamed when the past tries to eat the future. Trazyn twirled his staff and considered the taste of the title. I have always preferred galleries to thrones, he murmured. They have more exits. He took the audit key with 2 fingers and tucked it into his staff, as if stowing a blade he hoped never to draw. His coalition did not dissolve. It thinned and drifted, embarrassed into patience. The signing was not pomp. It was the click of mechanisms accepting new tolerances. Dynastic glyphs etched themselves beside human sigils and the angular sign of the in-between. Oaths were spoken in languages that did not translate their vowels, and yet the meaning carried. We hold the doors, Era said, voice quiet enough that even the null listened. We hold them for those who want to come and go. We do not teach wolves the hinges. We do not brick the windows. The charter absorbed the words like stone absorbing heat. Sister Edda returned to Sancta Lys with a copy of the clauses and taped them to a bell, so her novices would see the law every time they touched worship. She rewrote the hymnals, her pen scratching new pauses into old music, and taught the chorus how to sing around a silence that did not hate them. Cassian of House Voss packed away his navigating tools and took up beacon charts, learning how to measure distance with patience instead of fury. On a corridor world half a sector away, a baker who had chosen to remain in the hush opened her ovens and cut her loaves into slices precisely the size of a letter. She wrapped each in paper on which a message had been scrawled. We are still here. Ethan stood apart, while the council made itself heavy enough to stand without him. He watched the inscription seal into the floor and felt the gears tighten on his speech like weather turning. Era joined him and leaned her shoulder against his arm with the casualness of a woman who has decided he is furniture in the good sense, solid, familiar, permitted. This will hurt, she said, not as a threat, but as a truth worth owning. It will be slow. It will be mocked. You will hate it on days when every wheel grinds, and on those days You will remember the crown on the table and not pick it up. I will forget where I left it, he said, and for the first time, she heard something like a joke in his voice. Valthera received another recall, writ from Terra, that assumed the previous ones had been obeyed. She drafted a reply that read like an apology, and was, in fact, a resignation from the part of herself that had believed obedience was the last virtue. I remain as liaison under the compact, she wrote. I will answer to your questions in person when the corridor can spare me. Until then, send your censure by post. The mail still runs. Korath signed an annex that placed his regiments under joint command for the defense of beacon sites. He also wrote his own severance clause in soldier scrawl. New bosses do not get my dead for free. By dusk, the administration of light chosen rather than inherited, the Mechanicus ring had pulled back to a respectful distance and begun composing lists of experiments they might ask permission to conduct. The Argent sabers set their orbit like a halo and did not sharpen it. The Necron coalition spun apart with the wary grace of predators deciding to hunt elsewhere today. The screaming crown howled from beyond the horizon and tasted the new shape pressed against the warp with interest. It liked fear better than compromise. It would come again when the price was higher. In Ilio's chamber, Era tucked the rings under the boy's pillow and kissed his brow because ritual teaches the body what law tries to do with ink. We made a door, he murmured, already sliding into sleep. We made lots. We made one, she corrected, smoothing his hair. We will make it every morning. Ethan returned to the Hall of Echoes after the last signatures dried and picked up the circlet. Now a thing that belonged to the past, even as it fit his brow. He did not place it on his head. He set it in a niche at shoulder height, where a hand could touch it to remember weight without taking it up. Era stood with him in the hush and counted breaths, as she had learned to do after battles that did not announce themselves with guns. Outside, the Aurora held. Inside, new rooms were mapped. Between, a council learned to disagree in ways that did not end with fire. The silent revolution did not roar. It took root like a stubborn weed in old stone, breaking it by insisting on growing. Far off, the storm coiled and considered. Near at hand, someone's child began to laugh in their sleep, and no one shushed them. Morning on Kol Serath did not arrive with colour so much as with permission. The aurora that marked the hush thinned to a pale veil, and the city's metal skin remembered how to glow without being commanded. Bells, carefully rehung on Sanctalese, sent a measured peal across the corridor by recorded relay. One note, then two, then a third left deliberately absent, a space for breath. Along a chain of worlds, the first clauses of the compact took shape as things you could touch. Beacons calibrated and named, chapels where psychers learn new liturgies for their gifts, workshops where Mechanicus observers washed their hands and asked for access with sentences that had the word please stapled on, like a novelty. The Screaming Crown had not returned that week. Its absence felt less like mercy than like time granted to the living, to finish sweeping the blood into manageable corners. Valthara Keth went back to Terra by a corridor that did not exist on most maps. She left her rosette on the table in a room that ate secrets and accepted censure with the posture of a woman standing in a doorway. She returned as Ambassador Extraordinary to the Silent Compact, her writ endorsed reluctantly by people who had run out of tidy punishments that did not cost them prestige. She learned to speak in halls that made obedience sound like air, and to translate that air into rules that did not suffocate. She told High Lords, with perfect courtesy, that discipline without future was vanity, and told compact delegates with perfect bluntness that grace without teeth was surrender. When she stepped onto Shrine World marble, pilgrims pressed coins into her hand as if the gesture might purchase more of the quiet. She gave the coins to the engineers who taught children how to replace a beacon's crystal without slicing their thumbs. Marshal Korath Vex took command of the 1st Argent Cohort, a joint formation with too many names to parade and just enough discipline to not need them. Necron Immortals practiced pivot drills beside Cadian veterans who had learned to call the glossy giants bookends instead of statues. Lichguard shield lines anchored breaches while guardsmen rotated through with all the messy grace of people who had decided living mattered. The cohort's Medicate tent housed a cryopallet and a surgeon's curtain. Repairs happened in both with equal swearing. In their first test, a cult uprising on a refinery too near the corridor, Null engineers planted portable pylons that shaved sorcery to sparks, while Korath's fire teams threaded alleys the phalanxes would have flattened. Later, he walked the line, counting faces and failures, and admitted to Ethan over a clipped channel that learning to lean on precision had taught him where to aim bravery. Ethan replied that learning to account for bravery had taught him where to leave room for decisions that could not be modelled. Era took her place in the in-between order, with the unadorned gravity of someone refusing a throne and accepting a chair. She wrote the first threshold protocols for pauses, the clauses that allowed the council to stop and drink water before voting when a seam frayed. She chaired hearings where blanks told the rooms what noise had done to them and what silence might yet cost them. She walked between beacon chapels and engine rooms, her presence smoothing machines into patience and soothing congregations into an honesty that did not need to be loud. She scolded Magos Heliox Theta for assuming custodianship where witness was the proper verb, and made him laugh once, small and surprised, when he caught himself asking permission to open a drawer. She sent quiet operatives to iterate doors on worlds not yet enlarged by trust, and kept a pack half-filled under her bed, even after the competence seal was affixed in a dozen capitals, because love and experience had taught her that travel happens without warning. Ilior grew with the kind of speed that startles immortals. He passed from hand to running to the first time he fell hard enough to frighten the room. He learned the alphabet that beacons use to tell each other where they are, and added flourishes because he liked how letters looked when they leaned. He watched Sister Edda teach novices to sing against a hush that did not bite, and learned to fill rest with listening instead of fear. Children on Corridor Worlds spoke his name like a story. The boy who was not a machine and not a miracle. The boy who made doors. The boy who carried wooden rings and showed adults how to twist them wrong until a way appeared. When an administrator in a grey hall tried to tack Prince to his meaning, he ducked under the word and ran out to where Korath's soldiers were arguing with a lich guard about the proper way to stack rifles, and returned with both stacks improved. The compact spread in lines that did not aim for dominion so much as for tenure. Valtera Prime chose silence for its port districts and left the theatre quarter alive with authorized noise. Ratch's Minor built a school for harbour masters, navigators, who would read beacon light instead of warp winds. Jorik Voss lectured under a sky that no longer roared and taught apprentices how to be proud of a skill their ancestors had not needed. Sancta Lees commissioned new mosaics in colours that had relearned how to be daring. The central panel showed hands of metal and flesh, setting a crown down on a table between them and walking away. A mining moon that had expected to be ignored became the site of the first in-between house, where blanks found space to breathe and a stipend that admitted the price of their gift. The Mechanicus set up labs on a dorsal plane of Kolserath, where Heliox Theta learned the pleasure and discomfort of being a guest. The Argent Sabres watched from their high orbit, Chaplain Dacian turning pages in a book that now contained addenda written in a finer hand. When Chaos tested a beacon on the corridor's far edge by throwing a storm of mouths at it, Astartes, strike cruisers, and Necron scythes arrived in elegant, reluctant tandem to cut the attack into ash. Dacian knelt in a chapel lit with borrowed power and wrote a new vow. We will not mistake compromise for rot, nor vigilance for hunger. His chapter master signed it and asked Valthara, in his grave courtesy, whether she had found unemployment to her taste. It is busy, she answered, which was a kind of yes. Not everything held cleanly. A dynasty refused its seat and went to sulk in a cluster of dead stars. 2 beacon worlds withdrew after elections replaced old men with older fears. A Mechanicus forge sent a salvage team under a blessing that read like theft and was turned away with every courtesy short of force. A sect of zealots petitioned for an exemption that would have allowed them to shout their god's name at volumes the hush would not tolerate. The request was denied, and the denial upheld in a court that had learned how to put teeth into kindness. The Screaming Crown appeared once at distant range, tested the new geometry pressed against the Imperium, smiled like an ulcer, and slid away to fatten on wars that had survived elsewhere. Ethan Sable, no longer the only bearer of the title he had confessed, learned the discipline of not touching the circlet in its niche. He presided sometimes, moderated more often, and practiced saying, "I do not know," in a voice that did not sound like strategy. He refused 3 emergency extensions, accepted 2 with locks attached, and watched the gears he had given himself tug his speech back toward questions when old habits reached for imperatives. He visited workshops and chapels that had not existed when he was a king who preferred thunder, and found his footsteps softer than he remembered. He allowed Trazyn to keep minutes in a way that read like theatre and felt like history. The archivist decorated the margin notes with illustrations of doors. There were funerals. The compact did not protect against mortality. It did allow mothers to sleep before their children died, and sometimes sleep was enough to turn their stories into other endings. Ethan learned to attend services for strangers and to leave before the part where people tried to forgive him aloud. He had asked not to be forgiven in public, and the request was slowly becoming understood. Error caught him at the edge of one ceremony, where hands of flesh and hands of metal had passed a candle back and forth until the wick refused to go out and touched his wrist lightly. "You do not have to like any of this," she said. "You do have to do it." He did it. He met with governors who feared their poets would never shout again, and taught them how to build rooms where shouting was a sacrament instead of a symptom. He listened to overlords rehearse grievances that were older than the languages used to express them, and asked which regrets they were willing to feed. He walked through the harbour master school with Jorik Voss and watched apprentices map corridors with the patience of men and women who had learned that speed is not always mastery. He asked Sister Edda to write a hymn that counted in 3s and left a 4th beat for breath. She sent him a recording and a note that said, "Kindly, I will teach you to sing after you learn to listen." On an evening marked by no ceremony more formal than tea poured into heavy cups, Valtera returned to Kolserath with a delegation of representatives from worlds that had sworn nothing and suspected everything. She spoke to them of repairs and reluctance and roofs. She did not mention the torpedo that had peeled a rib from the hall, or the letter from an old mentor that ended with the word coward. She had written back that day simply, "I am busy." They walked the promenade beneath pylons that hummed like content machinery, and children with paper kites that would not tear. One of the delegates, a synodist with ink-flecked fingers, put her palm on the hull of a beacon and said, "We could live with this." Valthara allowed herself to smile. Era took Ilya to the edge of the hush where it met the living air. She did this on purpose, and often. "Balance asks to be practiced," she told him, the words engraved by repetition into good luck. He held his rings and made up names for constellations that did not move because the lights he was naming were beacons, not stars. He told Era that was better because beacons choose to be steady. He practiced being wrong until something worked. When he fell, which he did and would, he learned to look up before he got up to see whether the sky had changed. It never had, and the lesson comforted him in a way that did not make him lazy. At last, on a night when the aurora wore its thinnest veil, and the beacons around Kolserath flashed a pattern that meant, "This is ours for now," Ethan took Ilya to the observatory at the city's crown. They climbed a narrow stair, Ira following out of habit that needed no justification. The dome opened on a sky that had relearned how to be a ceiling without being a trap. Stars showed themselves. Some were dying, as always. Some were not. Between them, black water waited for names. Ethan sat with his back against a pillar and the child tucked into the crook of his arm, the wooden rings clicking a quiet rhythm that could have been a prayer if you cared how prayers were made. "Tell me about them," Ilya said. "Tell me why they don't fall." "They do," Ethan said. "They fall into each other, and the falling is how they make heat. The trick is to fall in ways that make light instead of holes." "Like doors," Ilya murmured, satisfied. "Like doors," Ethan agreed. He pointed to the steady glimmer of a beacon that marked the corridor's spine. "Some lights are stars. Some are promises. Both can guide you if you remember what they are." "Is the quiet a star or a promise?" Ilya asked. "Both," he said again, and Ira snorted, because sometimes philosophy needed teasing. "The quiet is the space you make so the song can decide how to sound. It is not the song. It is not the end of songs. It is the chance. Can we keep it?" Ilya asked at last, the question all children ask about things that feel too big and too good. "We can keep making it," Ethan said. "That is different." "Better. I think it means you get to help." He showed the boy how to mark the difference between silence and vacuum, between a weapon and a shelter, between a pause and an ending. He traced the corridor like a bracelet around the wrist of space and taught him the names of worlds that had chosen to sleep on purpose. He told the story of a crown set on a table, and of hands that held it in place by not lifting it, and of a council that learned how to be loud in the quiet without breaking the room. He did not call himself king. He called himself by the name his mother had given him when stars were closer and simpler, and Ilya repeated it as if trying out a note he might wish to keep. Below them, the compact moved, slow, stubborn, subject to pettiness and surprise. A Mechanicus adept apologized when he arrived late to a meeting because the corridor had been crowded, and no one laughed at the truth in the excuse. A guardsman and a lich guard argued over the proper angle of a door, and decided to build both so the choice would never be singular again. A priest and a poet rewrote a benediction to fit the room it was spoken in. A woman on a corridor moon baked bread by slicing heat into careful pieces and sent a package that arrived 3 months later with a note that said, "We remembered you." The galaxy remained dangerous. Far spirals away, empires fed themselves the language of hunger and called it destiny. Chaos waited with the patience of mold in stone. The compact could not cure history. It could make futures edible. The silent march moved outward with a humility that felt like a muscle being strengthened, not a sword being dulled. Worlds petitioned for entry and were told yes with caveats, and no with reason. In the spaces between those answers, people learned to stand in the doorway and decide. "Listen," Ethan said, and Ilior held very still. The hush carried the thrum of engines and the far-off laughter of someone not yet asleep. Somewhere, a bell rung against the quiet and found it hospitable. Somewhere else, a prayer that had forgotten how to be heard tried again. The sky did not shatter. The beacons held. "We can keep making it," Ilior repeated, "because some sentences require rehearsal to become true." They sat until the first thin line of administrated dawn drew along the horizon, and then a second line, and then a third left missing so that breathing could still be counted. Era rose first, joints cracking like kindly wood, and offered her hand as if presenting a new oath. Ethan took it because he had learned that sharing weight was cleaner than calling it strength. Ilior took both of theirs because two hands meant a door. They went down the stair into a city that had kept itself alive without waiting on trumpets. The aurora burned like a promise that had learned to refuse grandeur. The march did not stop. It did not trample. It set its pace to the measure of those who walked beside it. And where the silence touched the world, it left room for songs that had been hoarded until now. The galaxy was still a field for ruin, a theatre for appetites. It had become, in a few more places than yesterday, a home. The hush advanced, not as a final word, but as a way to begin sentences with care. The crown stayed on the table. The doors remembered how to open and when not to. The boy learned the names of lights. The man learned how to point. The night did not end, but the dawn had chosen to start in the places where someone had asked it to.